Hey there, night travellers. An empire bigger than half of Europe, 10 million people, hundreds of thousands of warriors, roads longer than Rome ever built, enough gold to fill an entire room, and yeah, we will get back to that room later. All of it gone in 18 months, not from an invasion, not from a disaster, from 168 men. 168. That is not a typo. That is just history being completely unhinged. How is that even possible? Spoiler. The answer is not just, oh, they had guns and horses. Something was deeply, fundamentally off inside the Inca Empire long before the first Spanish boot ever touched the Andes. Tonight we find out exactly what. Hit that like button if you are in for the full ride, and drop a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from right now. Lights down, blanket on, let's climb. Before we get anywhere near the collapse, we have to understand what was actually being knocked over. Because the Inca Empire was not just large. It was the kind of large that, by every reasonable rule of how civilizations are supposed to grow, should not have been physically possible. The Inca did not, technically, call themselves the Inca. That word originally referred only to the ruling family, the royal bloodline based in the mountain city of Cusco. The state itself had a different name, and a better one, Tawantinsuyu. The four parts joined together, four enormous regions stitched into a single political body, and draped across the western spine of South America like a long, stubborn woolen scarf. It started up near the southern edge of present-day Colombia, slipped down through Ecuador, ran the entire length of Peru, swept through Bolivia, cut down across northern Chile, and reached into northwestern Argentina. Roughly 2.5 million square kilometers. For a sense of scale, this was larger than the Roman Empire at its peak territorial expansion, larger than ancient Persia, larger than dynastic Egypt at any point in its 3,000-year run. If you laid it on top of a modern map of Europe, it would cover the entire European Union and still have leftovers to drape over the United Kingdom and a healthy chunk of Norway. In American terms, it would swallow the continental United States from California to Mississippi without straining. And the people running this thing somehow managed it from one mountain capital sitting at almost 3,500 meters above sea level. They held it together with messengers on foot. They built it without horses. They paved it without wheels. They taxed it without coins. They governed it without writing. And just to add a final touch of difficulty, they did all of this on top of, or between, some of the highest, most aggressive mountains on the planet. Naturally, the obvious question is how, and the slightly less obvious but more honest answer is that we still are not entirely sure. Let us go through the missing pieces one at a time, because this list is genuinely strange. No wheel, or rather, they had the concept of a wheel, in the sense that small ceramic toys with rolling axles have been recovered from Inca-era children's burials. So they knew round things could roll. They simply did not apply that knowledge to anything larger than a doll, which is roughly as useful for hauling building stones up a mountainside as it sounds. On closer inspection, this was not as ridiculous as it first looks. If you have ever tried to push a cart uphill on a steep dirt path, you know that wheels and slopes have a complicated relationship. The Andes are mostly slope. They are vertical landscape with the occasional pause for breath. A wheeled cart on a 5,000-meter mountain pass would not have been a transport revolution. It would have been an expensive way to lose your cargo into a valley. No draft animals. Eurasia got extremely lucky in this department. Horses, oxen, donkeys, water buffalo, camels. The Americas got the llama. The llama is a magnificent creature, tall, dignified, surprisingly fluffy, and equipped with what biologists politely call defensive saliva. But it is not a workhorse. A grown llama can carry maybe 30 kilos comfortably, and if you load it with much more than that, it will simply sit down and refuse, possibly while making direct eye contact with you. You cannot hitch a llama to a plough. You cannot reasonably ride one. You cannot run a cavalry division on llamas no matter how committed you are. So the Inca had no ploughing animals and no riding animals. They had pack animals that could carry your laundry uphill if you asked very politely. No writing. Or at least no writing in the sense that historians used to recognize. There was no Inca equivalent of cuneiform tablets, no hieroglyphs carved into stone monuments, no royal scribe sitting under a roof etching down the king's deeds onto a page. We will come back to what they had instead, because it is one of the most interesting parts of this story, and the part Europeans most badly misjudged. For now, just hold the basic fact in your head. The largest empire in pre-Columbian America did not have writing in any form that Spain would recognize on first contact, No coins, no money, no markets in the way you and I would understand the word. There were no Inca pesos. There were no travelling merchants haggling over the price of corn. There were no shops, no banks, no loans, no interest rates, and no one walking around with a purse jingling pleasantly at their hip. The entire economy ran on something else, which we will dig into later in the story, and that something else is part of why this empire was so weirdly fragile when the wrong kind of stress finally arrived. No iron. The Inca knew about copper, bronze, gold, and silver. Their metalworking was actually superb. They could pour, hammer, and alloy with extraordinary precision, and they decorated palaces in sheets of beaten gold that the Spanish would later describe, in their letters home, in tones of barely contained drooling. But they never made the leap to iron, which meant no iron weapons, no iron tools, no iron armour. Their best swords were made of hardwood edged with sharpened obsidian. Their best armour was quilted cotton, which is genuinely effective against arrows and bronze maces, but performs less spectacularly when a Spanish blade made of Toledo steel arrives at the party. So, if you are keeping a tally at home, no writing, no wheel, no draft animals, no money, no iron. And yet they ran an empire roughly the size of the Roman Empire, in some of the harshest terrain on Earth, for about a century. That timeline, by the way, is its own little miracle. Most of what we call the Inca Empire was assembled in roughly 90 years. Before the middle of the 1400s, the Inca were a respectable but unremarkable mountain kingdom centered on Cusco, surrounded by rivals of similar size. Then came a ruler named Pachacuti, whose name translates as something like world shaker, and the world accordingly got shaken. Within his lifetime and the reigns of his immediate descendants, the Inca went from being one local power among many to absorbing every neighbouring culture from the Pacific to the Amazon basin, and from the Colombian border to central Chile. 3 generations of warlords, planners, and bureaucrats took a city-state and turned it into a continental empire. To put that pace in modern context, it is as if Switzerland announced in 1930 that it intended to control everything between Lisbon and Moscow, and then actually achieved it before 1960. The first crack at expansion came under Pachacuti's father, Viracocha Inca, who was rather notably not the one who managed it. The traditional story, told later in carefully composed oral history, runs roughly like this. A neighbouring people called the Chanca decided that Cusco looked vulnerable and marched on it in force. Viracocha, on hearing this news, did something that any reasonable middle-aged king might do under the circumstances. He left. He packed up and retreated to a fortress in the hills, taking his designated heir with him. The young prince who would become Pachacuti, however, refused to evacuate. He stayed in the city, rallied whatever defenders remained, and according to legend, was joined in the fight by the very stones of the plain, which rose up at his command and turned into warriors. Whether you take the magical stone soldiers literally or read them as a poetic description of irregulars and farmers grabbed at the last minute, the result was the same. The Chanca were broken in a single battle. Pachacuti's father returned, found his city had been saved without him, and quietly retired from public life. The new ruler had arrived, and he had every intention of making sure no enemy ever stood at the walls of Cusco again. The simplest way to achieve that, it turned out, was to make sure there was no land left where an enemy could base themselves. Cusco itself was rebuilt under Pachacuti into something deliberately monumental. The new capital was laid out, according to several Spanish chroniclers who saw it before they finished destroying it, in the shape of a crouching puma, with the head represented by the fortress of Sacsayhuaman on the high ground above the city, and the tail formed by the meeting of 2 rivers below. Whether the puma layout was deliberate from the start or read into the plan after the fact is still debated by archaeologists. What is not debated is the stonework. The Inca were, simply put, some of the best stone fitters in human history. Their finest masonry consists of enormous polygonal blocks, some weighing many tons, cut with such precision that the joints between them are tighter than the gap in a closed book. You cannot fit a knife blade between the stones. No mortar was used. The blocks interlock with each other along carefully shaped contact surfaces, often with subtle indentations and bosses that fix them in place, and the resulting walls have survived dozens of major earthquakes that have levelled the colonial Spanish churches built on top of them. There is, in Old Cusco, a famous stone in one of the surviving Inca walls with 12 distinct sides. It fits its neighbours perfectly. How exactly the Inca achieved this level of fit, working with bronze and stone tools on stones that often weigh more than a small car, remains one of those gentle archaeological mysteries that the field has more or less learned to live with. Experimental work has shown that patient labour, abrasive sand, water and bronze chisels can in principle produce such results. The patient labour required, however, was extraordinary. The army that grew out of Pachacuti's reforms was, by the standards of the Americas, enormous. Estimates vary wildly, as estimates always do for ancient armies, but the better guesses put a fully mobilised Inca field force at somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 men. This was not a standing professional army in the Roman or modern sense. It was a system of rotating service, drawn from every province in the empire on a quota basis. A village owed a certain number of fighting-age men to the state for a defined period. While those men served, the state fed them, equipped them, and paid for everything from their sandals to their feathered helmets. When their term was up, they returned home. New men rotated in. The result was that the empire could put a force of staggering size into the field on relatively short notice, drawn from communities that had been trained, sorted and tracked through the same census system that the Quipucamayok maintained. Weapons were straightforward and effective for the kind of warfare the Inca normally fought. Slings, used with great skill and capable of cracking helmets at remarkable range. Bronze-tipped spears, wooden clubs studded with stone or bronze. A particular favourite was a star-headed mace with multiple radiating points, used to crush an opponent's helmet or skull at close range. Bows and arrows existed but were more commonly used by the jungle peoples on the eastern frontier than by Inca regulars themselves. Defensive equipment was, as mentioned, quilted cotton armour and small wooden shields. In their normal context, fighting other Andean armies with similar equipment, this kit was perfectly adequate. Inca tactics emphasised overwhelming numbers, careful logistics, and, where possible, peaceful absorption rather than outright conquest. Provinces that could be persuaded to join the empire by negotiation, gifts to their nobility, and the promise of integration into the imperial economy were preferred targets. Provinces that refused this offer received the negotiation a second time, with a much larger audience present in armour. Once a region was inside the empire, it stayed inside through a policy that may have been the single cleverest piece of Inca statecraft. It was called the mitma system, or mitimis, in the form most Spanish chroniclers used. The idea was straightforward and quietly ruthless. When a new province was added, the imperial administration would identify communities likely to cause trouble, communities whose loyalty to the Inca was suspect, and physically relocate them. Entire villages would be moved, often hundreds of kilometres, into the heart of an established loyal region. In their place, the administration would settle communities from loyal areas who could be trusted to keep an eye on the newly conquered land and report back. The result was that no region in the empire was ethnically or linguistically homogeneous for long. Pockets of relocated populations were scattered across the map, surrounded by older loyal populations, with their old homelands repopulated by other loyalists. It was a deliberate scrambling of the human geography of the continent, intended to make rebellion practically impossible to organise. You could not raise an army of your own people. Your own people were 1,000 kilometres away in a valley they had never seen before, growing crops they had never grown, surrounded by neighbours who reported to the local Inca governor. To bind the whole arrangement together, the imperial language, Quechua, was spread aggressively into every new region as a kind of administrative lingua franca. Local languages were not banned. They simply found themselves competing with a language that the tax collector and the governor and the army recruiter all happened to speak. Within a generation or two, Quechua was the working tongue of the empire, and remained so long after the empire that imposed it had vanished. It is still spoken today by something like 8 million people across the Andean countries. The terrain alone deserves a moment of attention here, because it changes how impressive the whole thing is. We sometimes hear the phrase mountain empire and picture something cosy, a quaint stone village nestled in a green valley. The Andes are not cosy. They are the second largest mountain range on Earth, after the Himalayas. The highest Inca cities sat at altitudes around 3,400 metres, and their highest temples, mines, and way stations climbed past 5,000 metres into the kind of thin air that gives healthy adults headaches and altitude sickness within hours of arrival. The empire spanned every climate zone the planet has to offer. Tropical rainforests dripping wet in the Amazonian east, coastal deserts in the west that have not seen a real rainfall in human memory, cold high plateaus where the wind sounds like a person screaming, steep cloud forests where you can walk through an actual cloud on your way to lunch. To make this work logistically, the Inca had to invent agricultural solutions that still impress modern engineers. The terraced fields you see in old photographs of Machu Picchu and the Sacred Valley are not just decorative, they are climate machines. Each terrace level created a microclimate. Frost-sensitive crops grew lower. Frost-tolerant crops grew higher. The Inca built irrigation channels that pulled glacier melt across kilometers of rock face, with gradients so subtle that the water would arrive exactly where it needed to be, exactly when it needed to be there. Their agricultural research station at Moray consisted of concentric circular terraces sunk into the ground like an inverted amphitheatre, each ring designed to mimic a different altitude and climate, so botanists, although they did not call themselves that, could experiment with which potato variety grew best at which simulated elevation. This was, in essence, a Bronze Age agricultural laboratory carved into a mountainside. They had over 3,000 varieties of potato. For comparison, your local supermarket has maybe 7. This obsession with food was not random. Feeding a population of around 10 million people in this terrain required absolute mastery of the land, and here, finally, we start to see the outline of an answer to the original question. How did they hold it all together? The Inca did not run their empire by writing things down. They ran it by organizing reality so carefully that in many cases you did not need to write things down. Everyone in the empire had a function. Every village owed a precise quota of labor, a precise quota of goods, a precise quota of soldiers. The state knew, with frightening accuracy, exactly who lived where, exactly what they grew, exactly what they made, exactly how many fighting men they could field, and exactly how much they were expected to deliver to the imperial granaries each season. The granaries themselves were another small miracle. The Inca built thousands of storehouses called kolka, scattered through every region of the empire. Some were single, squat round buildings, others were entire campuses of warehouses stretching across hillsides like rows of stone teeth. They were positioned with such care that excavators today have found ventilation channels carved into the floor and walls to keep the air cold and dry. Freeze-dried potatoes called chuño could last in these storehouses for years without rotting. Maize, quinoa, dried meat, textiles, sandals, weapons, military uniforms, all kept ready at strategic locations. When a region had a bad harvest, the state opened a granary. When an army needed to march, the state opened a granary. When a public works project required 10,000 workers fed for 6 months, the state opened a granary. It was a centrally planned supply chain that ran the length of an entire continent and worked, somehow, without a single ledger written in ink. And the absurd thing is, the people in charge of all of this could not write a single one of their own names. Not in the European sense. They were not signing forms or scribbling totals on parchment. They were keeping track of the food, the people, the soldiers, the textiles, the gold, the silver, the tribute schedules, the calendar, the festivals, the births and deaths, all of it, using a system that on the outside looked like nothing more than a bundle of coloured strings tied into knots. Which brings us neatly to the most underrated piece of technology in the entire pre-Columbian world. When the Spanish first arrived in the early 1530s, they noticed that Inca officials walked around carrying what looked like decorative fringes. Each one was a main horizontal cord with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of smaller cords hanging off it. The hanging cords were of different colours, twisted in different directions, knotted in different ways, at different heights along their length. To a European eye, this looked like a craft project, possibly a child's belt, possibly a strange tassel, definitely not a document. That craft project was called a quipu, and it was, in effect, the operating system of the empire. The basics of how quipu worked are reasonably understood today. The Inca used a base 10 positional numbering system, the same kind of decimal logic we use now. The position of a knot on a cord indicated its place value. A single knot near the bottom of a cord meant 1. The same knot one position higher meant 10. One position above that meant 100, and so on, up into the tens of thousands. The type of knot also mattered. A simple overhand knot, a long knot wound several times around the cord, a complex figure-8 knot. Each one carried different information. The colour of the cord conveyed yet another layer of meaning. White might mean silver, yellow might mean gold or maize, red might refer to soldiers or war, and combinations of two colours twisted together expanded the vocabulary further. By varying knot type, knot position, chord colour, chord twist direction, and chord placement on the main string, a single quipu could encode a remarkable amount of structured information in a form a trained official could read at a glance. The basic decimal structure was demonstrated reliably by an American researcher named Leland Locke in the 1920s, who managed to crack the numerical logic by comparing surviving quipu with each other. Later researchers, including the team led by Gary Urton at Harvard, have pushed the work much further, building digital databases of every surviving quipu and looking for repeating patterns the way cryptographers look for repeating letters in a coded message. But here is the part that gets weirder. We can read the numbers on quipu. We can decode the tax counts and the population totals and the warehouse inventories. What we cannot fully read, even now, are the narrative quipu. Because Spanish chroniclers wrote in obvious tones of surprise that some quipu were not numerical. They told stories, they recorded songs, they held entire histories of kings and conquests. There were specialists who could recite, from a single quipu, the genealogy of every ruler in the dynasty going back generations, the speeches given at coronations, the outcomes of battles, the dates of festivals, the rules of conduct for nobility, even, in some cases, what we would now call poetry. This is where the modern academic conversation gets interesting and a little philosophical. Was the quipu a writing system? Or was it a memory aid? Was the official reading the strings? Or was the official reciting from memory and using the strings the way a good lecturer might use bullet points on a slide? Or was it something in between? Something neither fully a script nor fully a notebook, a hybrid that European categories simply did not have a word for. Recent research has identified patterns in surviving quipu that suggest at least some of them did encode phonetic information, possibly syllables, possibly names of people or places. The full system, however, may have died with the last specialists who knew how to read it. Those specialists were called quipu kamayok, which translates roughly as keeper of the knots. To become one, a child entered training young, often as part of the noble class, and spent years memorizing the conventions, the regional variations, the color codes, the knot grammar, the songs and recitations attached to specific chord patterns. A senior quipu kamayok could walk into a regional capital, sit down with the local archive, and within an afternoon give you a complete picture of every household in the province. How many people lived there? How many were children? How many were elders? How many were fit for military service? How many for labour service? How many for textile work? How many were currently sick? He could tell you how many sandals were stored in which warehouse, how many sacks of corn, how many shafts of bronze. He could tell you the last 3 years of tax compliance for every village in his jurisdiction. He could tell you which families owed which kinds of labour, and when their next obligation came due. He was doing all of this from a tangle of coloured cord that, to an untrained eye, looked like the contents of a particularly disorganised sewing basket. The Spanish, to their credit, did notice the quipu were doing something important. To their less credit, they also noticed that the quipu were doing something they could not control. The Catholic Church in particular took the position that anything the Inca could not explain in Latin to a friar was probably suspect, and in 1583 a council of bishops in Lima ordered that quipu be destroyed wherever they were found, on the grounds that they might contain heretical or pagan knowledge. Tens of thousands of these objects were burned. The number that survived to the present day is estimated at about 1,000, out of what was likely once a national archive of millions of separate records. The cruelest part of this story, if you're the kind of person who finds dry irony cruel, is that the same Spanish who burned the quipu also kept their own official accounts on paper, which rots. 500 years later, large parts of the surviving quipu corpus are in better physical condition than the Spanish colonial documents that were supposed to replace them. Now, even granted that the quipu were doing the work of paperwork, there is still the problem of physical distance. A perfect tax record sitting in a Cusco archive does no good if the tax collector in some northern valley is 6 weeks away on foot and has no way to send updates. You need information to move, across deserts, over mountain passes, through rainforests, faster than any animal in your possession, which, as established, is mainly the llama. You need, in short, infrastructure. The Inca built infrastructure. The road system was called Chapak Ñan, which means royal road, and it was almost certainly the most ambitious public works project on the planet at the time. The Roman road network at its peak ran somewhere around 80,000 kilometres across all of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The Inca road network ran somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 kilometers, depending on how you count side branches and ceremonial routes. That is less than Rome on paper, but it was built across landscape that would have stopped a Roman legion in its tracks within a week. We are talking about roads carved into the sides of cliffs, paved with hewn stone slabs, climbing in stairs cut directly into bedrock when the slope got too steep for normal travel. We are talking about causeways elevated above swamps. We are talking about tunnels punched through rock when going around was not practical. We are also talking about suspension bridges. The Inca were exceptional bridge builders. Their solution to the problem of crossing the deep canyons of the Andes was to weave thick cables from braided grass and other plant fibers, anchor them to stone abutments on opposite cliffs, and lay woven flooring between them. These bridges were sturdy enough to carry pack trains and military units, swung gently in the wind, and were rebuilt every year by local communities as part of their tax obligation to the empire. One of these, the Quesuechaca Bridge in southern Peru, is still rebuilt by descendants of the original communities every June, using the same braided grass technique, and you can walk across it. It has been in continuous annual reconstruction for more than 500 years, which makes it, in a strange way, older than every steel bridge currently in service anywhere in the world. There were two main trunk routes through the empire. One ran the length of the coastal desert. The other ran the spine of the Andes, threading through high passes and over mountain shoulders. Dozens of cross routes connected the two like the rungs of a very long ladder. Side roads branched off into every administrative region, every major town, every important shrine. At intervals along all of it, the Inca built way stations called tambo. These were combination rest stops, supply depots, and small hostels, spaced roughly a day's walk apart. Each tambo held fresh provisions, blankets, fresh sandals, and trained staff. If you were a state messenger or a travelling official, you simply stopped at the next tambo, swapped your worn-out gear for fresh gear, ate, and kept going. The roads were so well engineered and so well maintained that some sections of them are still walkable today, almost 5 centuries after the empire that built them collapsed. Hikers on the famous trail to Machu Picchu are in many places walking on the original Inca paving. And then there were the chasqui. The chasqui were professional relay runners, trained from childhood, stationed in pairs at small huts placed every 2 to 3 kilometers along the main roads. The job was elegantly simple. When a message came in, you ran with it at full sprint until you reached the next hut. At the next hut, a fresh runner would already be standing in the road, hand out, ready to receive the message and the verbal summary that came with it. You handed it over. He sprinted off. You went back to your hut and rested. Then you waited for the next message in the other direction. 2 to 3 kilometers, hard, then rest. By organizing the route this way, the empire could keep a message moving 24 hours a day, in any weather, at the sustained sprint speed of a fit young human across thousands of kilometers. Chasqui training began in boyhood. Boys identified as fast runners were enrolled in a state program that worked them up to the kind of endurance needed for the role. They learned to memorize verbal messages word for word, repeat them back, and confirm out loud at each handoff to make sure no information had been distorted. They carried a special conch shell that they could blow into as they approached the next station to signal an incoming runner, so the next chasqui would be on his feet and ready. They also carried a small quipu when the message required numerical content, the way a modern delivery driver might carry both a signed slip and a scanned barcode. The result was a postal system that, by some calculations, was faster than the Roman cursus publicus, and faster than anything in pre-modern Europe. The classic example, repeated by several Spanish chroniclers because it astonished them, was the delivery of fresh fish from the Pacific coast to the imperial palace in Cusco, fresh ocean fish, caught that morning, carried by chasqui relay, with iced storage along the way using ice brought down from glaciers for precisely this purpose, into the mountain capital, in time for the emperor's dinner. The straight-line distance is about 400 kilometers, and the actual route climbs from sea level to 3,500 meters, by foot, through canyons, across rivers. The chasqui could reportedly cover that distance in about 2 days. A military order from the capital could reach a frontier garrison 2,000 kilometers north within a week. A change of tax policy could be communicated to every regional capital within roughly 15 days. A report of bandits, an unrest in a province, the death of a noble, the arrival of foreign visitors, all of it flowed through this human network at speeds that, again, outpaced what was happening on European roads at the same point in history. Now, you may be sensing a pattern at this point. Everything the Inca built was beautiful, ambitious, and weirdly centralized. The roads were not just trade routes. They were imperial property, maintained by imperial labor, traveled primarily by imperial officials and imperial armies. Ordinary people could not just stroll along Capacñan with their goods, because ordinary people, in the strict Inca sense, did not have goods to trade in the European meaning of the word. There were no merchants going up and down those roads selling spices and silks. There were officials, soldiers, runners, work crews and pilgrims. Trade in the way Europe or the Aztec world understood trade barely existed. The roads existed to move the state. And here is where we get the first hint of what was about to go very, very wrong. A road system this efficient, this fast, this perfectly engineered for the movement of information and goods and armies has one quietly terrifying property. Whatever you can move along it, your enemy can also move along it. The road that carries your tax messengers at top speed will, as given the right circumstances, also carry an invading army at top speed. The road that allows you to react to a problem within days also allows a problem to spread across your empire within days. A network this beautifully connected has no fire breaks. There are no isolated provinces to fall back into. There is no slow frontier. Everything is, in effect, next door to everything else. When the Spanish eventually rode up these roads, they were astonished at how easy the march was. The Inca had paved the route that would be used to conquer the Inca. The same was true, even more devastatingly, of something invisible: microbes. We will talk about this in detail later in the story, but for now, hold on to this image. A magnificent stone highway, winding up into the mountains, perfectly maintained, perfectly equipped with fresh supplies at every tambo, perfectly defended by perfectly organized garrisons, and along it, moving at chasqui speed, an infection that no human being on the entire continent has ever encountered before. The same infrastructure that made the empire possible would also make its undoing extraordinarily fast. Tawantinsuyu was, in a sense, a machine. An enormous, intricate, hand-built machine, running on knotted string for memory, human legs for communication, terraces for food, llamas for cargo, and the centralized vision of a single dynasty that believed, with total conviction, that the four parts could be welded into one. The machine worked against every expectation. It worked beautifully for nearly a century, and it was built so tightly, so optimized for one specific way of doing things, that when it broke, it would break all at once. We have one more piece to look at before we get anywhere near the breaking, because the strangest engine inside this empire was not the quipu, and it was not the roads, it was the economy. And the economy ran on something almost no other large civilization in history has ever quite managed to make work. That something was reciprocity. Not trade, not money, not profit. Reciprocity, in the strictest possible sense of the word. The Inca economy was built around the idea that human beings owed each other things. Families owed villages, villages owed regions, regions owed the state, and the state, in return, owed everyone. The basic transaction was not a peasant handing over a sack of grain in exchange for a coin. It was a peasant handing over a stretch of his own working life in exchange for being fed, clothed, defended, and entered into the imperial register as a productive subject of the four parts joined together. The local building block was something called the Alu. The Alu was a kinship community, usually based on shared descent from a common ancestor, that held land collectively and worked it together. It is roughly comparable to an extended clan, although that word does not quite capture the way an Alu functioned as an economic and ritual unit at the same time. Each Alu had its own fields, its own elders, its own protective spirits, and its own quota of obligations to the imperial state. Members of an Alu helped each other plant, helped each other harvest, helped each other build houses, helped each other bury their dead. The principle that governed this internal cooperation was called Aini. The rough translation is something like balanced exchange, though it would be more accurate to call it the polite expectation that today's help would be returned in kind tomorrow. There was no written contract. There did not need to be. The community itself was the contract. Above the Ainu, the empire imposed its own slightly different version of the same idea, scaled up to a continental level. The state demanded labour. Specifically, it demanded a labour service called the meter. The meter was not a tax on what you produced. It was a tax on what you were. Every able-bodied man between the ages of roughly 18 and 50 was registered with the imperial administration and owed the state a certain number of days of work per year. The administration would decide, often years in advance, what those days would be spent on. You might be sent to work in a state-owned maize field. You might be conscripted to spend a season building or repairing a road. You might be summoned for service in a copper mine, or in a silver mine in the south, or in the great stone quarries above Cusco. You might be enrolled as a soldier and sent off to a frontier garrison. You might find yourself drafted into a construction crew building a new palace, or a new sun temple in a recently absorbed province, or a new system of terraces on a hillside that had just been declared suitable for maize. Whatever the task, the principle was the same. You did not pay tax in coins or crops. You paid in your own muscle and your own time. What you got in return, at least in theory, was completeness. While you were working for the state fed you. The imperial granaries kept you supplied with maize, freeze-dried potatoes, dried meat, and the fermented maize beer called chicha that was distributed liberally at public events. The state gave you sandals when yours wore out. The state issued you a uniform of woven wool or cotton when you were doing public labour. The state housed you, sometimes in purpose-built barracks at the worksite. The state provided medical care of a sort, in the form of access to herbalists and bone setters attached to large work crews. When the labour period was over, you went home, where the state was also active. While you'd been away, your home village was expected to continue feeding your family, because that work counted toward the same imperial ledger. If your wife or your children fell ill, neighbours helped. If your roof needed mending, neighbours mended it. The fields belonging to absent meter workers were tended by those still at home, because the obligation to help your absent neighbours was, in turn, registered as part of the village's own quota. There were 3 large categories of land in any imperial region. One portion belonged to the state. One portion belonged to the gods, which in practice meant the temples and the priesthood. One portion belonged to the local community, to be divided among Elu members according to their own customs. Everyone worked all 3. You worked the state fields first, then the temple fields, then your own. The order was not casual. It was a precise expression of who owed what to whom, performed in the dirt every planting season. The harvests went where they belonged. State maize went into state granaries. Temple maize went into temple stores to fund ceremonies, sacrifices, and the priesthood's daily needs. Community maize went to the Elu, which divided it among its members based on household size, age, and need. The Inca approach to need was actually fairly generous within its own terms. Widows, orphans, the elderly, and the physically disabled were all entitled to receive food and clothing from the same system that taxed everyone else's labour. In a certain light, the empire functioned as the planet's first continent-spanning welfare state, sustained entirely by the muscle of its own working population. This sounds, on the surface, almost suspiciously like a utopia. Universal employment, universal access to food, no starvation, no homeless population, no begging, no unemployment in the modern sense because everyone was constantly being assigned to one task or another. And it is true that, by the standards of pre-modern subsistence agriculture, the empire kept its general population better fed and better housed than most contemporary societies in Eurasia. The grim peasant of European medieval imagination, working a tiny scrap of land, hungry through the winter, paying half his harvest to a noble who provided very little in return, would actually have been somewhat surprised by the Inca arrangement. But before anyone gets too excited about an ancient Andean utopia, we need to talk about the small print. And the small print, as small print so often does, is where the real story lives. To begin with, personal freedom in our modern sense did not exist for ordinary people inside this empire. You were registered, you were sorted, you were placed into a labour category by imperial census officials according to your sex, your age, your physical condition, your skills, and the needs of the region. You did not choose your profession. The state chose it for you. If the state needed 1,000 new weavers in a textile workshop, it would identify women of weaving age within the appropriate communities and assign them. If the state needed 1,000 new soldiers, it identified the men, gave them their kit, and sent them. The Mitma policy mentioned earlier, which scrambled the human geography of the empire by relocating whole populations, was simply a more aggressive form of the same logic. You did not own your own location, the state did. You also could not travel without permission. The roads were imperial property, and movement along them was controlled. A peasant could not, on a whim, pack a bundle and decide to visit the coast for a holiday. because peasants did not have holidays in the modern sense, and the road system did not have civilian users in the modern sense. You could move when your work assignment required movement. You could move when a religious festival required your community's presence. Otherwise, you stayed where the census had placed you. You did not own land in the sense that you and I think about ownership. You had a share of community land, parcelled out to you and your family for the duration of your working life, with the size of the parcel adjusted as your family grew and shrank. When you died, the parcel returned to the aliu and was redistributed. You could not sell it, mortgage it, gift it, or leave it to a particular descendant of your choosing. Land was not the kind of thing one human being could individually possess. You did not, in any meaningful sense, accumulate wealth. Storage was a state function. Surplus went into state granaries, not into private barns. There were no markets at which to sell what you grew, because nobody was buying. Even if you somehow ended a year with extra goods, there was no economic mechanism for translating that extra into anything else. You could not save for retirement, because the state was your retirement. You could not become rich, because rich, as a concept, did not really exist for non-nobles. There were no private fortunes to build. There was only the slow and patient accumulation of standing within your community and within the imperial system, measured in things that were not transferable. Honour, reputation, the trust of your neighbours, the favour of your local official. You also could not change your social class. The empire was strictly hierarchical. At the very top sat the royal family. Below them sat the nobility, divided into two tiers, the Inca by blood and the Inca by privilege, the second being a category invented to absorb conquered local nobilities into the imperial structure, without giving them quite the same status as the original Cusco bloodlines. Below the nobility sat the various administrative castes, including the Quipucamayok and other state professionals. Below them sat the great mass of ordinary villagers, the commoners who farmed, herded, fished, wove, mined, built, fought, and ran messages. And at the bottom sat the Yanacona, a special category of permanent servants who had been removed from their original communities and attached to a noble household or a temple. The Yanacona were not slaves in the chattel sense. They could not be bought or sold. But they also could not leave, and their children inherited their status. Movement between any of these layers was, for practical purposes, impossible. You were born into your tier. You died in it. Your children inherited it. Now, given all of these constraints, the obvious question is why anyone tolerated it. And the honest answer is that, for the average villager, the trade was probably not terrible by the standards of the era. You worked hard, your life was prescribed, your travel was restricted, your savings were non-existent, and your career options were nil, but you did not starve. Your family had a roof, your roads were maintained, your festivals were funded, and a foreign army was not likely to descend on your fields and burn them. There was, in the practical sense, security. Quite a lot of it. The system was built to make sure ordinary people would not collapse, because ordinary people were the engine of the entire economy, and a collapsed engine cannot turn the wheels of empire. The state, in self-interest, took remarkably good care of the average producer. But this same arrangement carried an enormous structural weakness, and it is the part of the story that matters most for what is about to happen. When everything in an economy flows through one central system, and that system collapses, there is nowhere else to go. Modern market economies are deeply chaotic and inefficient by Inca standards, but they have a useful property. If one institution fails, others continue. If the bank goes down, the bakery is still selling bread. If the bakery closes, the supermarket is still selling flour. If the supermarket runs out, you grow vegetables in your own garden. There are layers of redundancy, because thousands of independent actors are pursuing their own interests in parallel. The Inca economy had no such redundancy. It had one system, one source of food distribution, one source of labour allocation, one source of cloth, sandals, weapons, granary access, and security. When that system stopped working, every other system that depended on it stopped at the same time. There was no second layer waiting to absorb the shock. There was also, and this is the deeper problem, no concept of independent civilian commerce that could continue if the state broke. In Europe, when the Western Roman Empire fell, traders kept trading, monasteries kept making and selling things, peasants kept growing food and bartering it at small local markets, and the rough fabric of economic life continued at a reduced level. The fall of Rome was a catastrophe in many ways, but it did not extinguish the European economy. It just simplified it. There were merchants, there was money, there was contract, there was custom, there was law about owing and being owed. When the central state collapsed, these structures kept working in shrunken form. The Inca world had none of those backup systems because the empire had quite deliberately not built them. There were no merchants of any real scale. There were no markets in the European sense. There was no widely circulated currency that could serve as a store of value. There was no developed law of private contract. There was almost nothing the central state had not absorbed into itself. When the central state stumbled, the entire web of mutual obligation that the state had spent a century building stumbled with it. This is the system the Spanish would walk into, and almost without meaning to, take apart at the seams. To understand why it took apart so completely, however, we have to turn from the economy to the thing that sat at the absolute centre of everything else. Because the Inca state did not justify itself in economic terms. It did not claim to exist because it was efficient. It did not claim to exist because it delivered welfare. It existed because it was holy. Specifically, it existed because the man at the very top of the pyramid was not, in the strict belief of his subjects, a man at all. The official position of the imperial church, supported by the imperial nobility, and enforced through every ritual, ceremony, and public appearance the state organized, was that the Sapa Inca was a living god, not a man chosen by gods, not a man blessed by gods, a direct descendant of the sun, in a line that ran unbroken from the first Inca emerging out of Lake Titicaca to the current occupant of the throne. The sun, called Inti, was the supreme deity of the imperial pantheon. The Sapa Inca was Inti's child, his earthly form, his visible body walking among ordinary people. To question this was not merely treason. It was blasphemy, which was a much heavier thing in a culture where the boundary between religion and government did not really exist. The Inca pantheon was, in fact, large and complicated and absorbed gods from every region the empire conquered. Above Inti, in the older theological view, sat a creator god named Viracocha, sometimes spelled Viracocha, who had made the sun, the moon, and the world itself. Beside the sun was Mamaquilla, the moon goddess, who was associated with women, with calendrical timekeeping, and with the sacred silver that mirrored her face. Below them was Pachamama, the Earth Mother, who governed harvests and fertility, and was honoured with the first sip of any drink poured at any meal. And below all of these were countless local deities, called huacas, attached to specific mountains, springs, caves, stones, and ancestor lines. Every village had its huacas, every clan had its huacas. The landscape itself was alive with them. There were huacas built into walls, huacas marked by piled stones at crossroads, huacas in trees, huacas in old battlefields, huacas in springs that ran a particular colour. The Inca priesthood maintained a system of imaginary lines called siques, which radiated outward from the central temple in Cusco and connected hundreds of these huacas in a kind of citywide spiritual circuit board, with each line assigned to a particular noble family who was responsible for its upkeep. When the imperial state moved into a new province, it did not generally destroy the local gods. It absorbed them, ranking them politely below Inti in the imperial hierarchy, and in return demanded that the locals also acknowledge Inti's supreme status and his living son in Cusco. It was, in many ways, a brilliant strategy of religious empire building. Convert by inclusion rather than by erasure. The local god kept his shrine. He just sat one notch lower in the divine seating chart, and his priests now also paid quiet attention to the festivals of the sun. The Sapa Inca himself sat at the meeting point of all this theology. He was the political head of the state, the supreme military commander, the high priest of Inti, and the living link between the human and the divine. Every public action he took was therefore both a political act and a religious one. When he opened the planting season by personally digging a furrow in the imperial fields with a golden hoe, it was not symbolic in the modern, vaguely sentimental sense. It was, in the eyes of his subjects, literally the sun setting his hand to the earth. When he ordered a province to be conquered, the order was not merely the will of a king, it was the will of the sun. When he received visitors, they did so under conditions of elaborate ritual care, because the sun's son was not someone you simply wandered up to and started chatting with. The protocol surrounding the Sapa Inca was extraordinary and worth describing in some detail, because the gap between how the Inca treated their emperor and how the Spanish would later treat him is one of the recurring shocks of this story. You did not, as an ordinary subject, look directly at the Sapa Inca. To do so was a grave breach of etiquette, on the perfectly logical grounds that you do not look directly at the sun. When the emperor travelled in public, attendants walked ahead of him, and ordinary people in his path were expected to lower their heads, sometimes to prostrate themselves entirely until he had passed. Even high nobles approaching him in the audience hall did so with their gaze fixed on the floor and with a small symbolic burden carried on their shoulders as a sign that no one came before the emperor unburdened. The emperor himself was usually seated on a low stool of red wood, surrounded by attendants, framed by elaborate hangings of feathers and woven cloth, with his face partly screened by a fringe of red wool that hung from his forehead. The fringe, called the maskai pacha, was the actual physical symbol of his office. Without it, he was not, in the strict sense, emperor. With it, he was the sun walking among men. You did not touch the Sapa Inca. His body was, in the strict theological sense, sacred. Servants who attended him directly were drawn from carefully selected noble families and trained from childhood in the rituals of close proximity. When he ate, attendants placed each bite in front of him in a particular sequence. When he had finished a meal, the leftover food, the dishes he had used, and even the napkin or cloth he had wiped his mouth with were collected, taken away, and ceremonially burned. The reasoning was both ritual and practical. Ritually, anything that had touched the body of the sun's son was charged with sacred substance, and could not simply be tossed aside. Practically, in a society that took witchcraft seriously, allowing anything that had touched the emperor to fall into unauthorized hands would have been an open invitation to dark magic worked against the throne. You did not wear the emperor's clothes. He did not wear his clothes either, or rather, he wore each garment exactly once. Royal weavers produced an enormous quantity of fine cloth specifically for the imperial wardrobe, and once a piece had been worn, it joined the food and the dishes and went into the ceremonial fire. The volume of textile production this required was staggering. Tens of thousands of women, drawn from the Elu through a special category of state service called the Akela, spent their working lives weaving cloth that would clothe the emperor for one day and burn the next. To modern ears, this sounds wasteful in a way that is hard to reconcile with the empire's general reputation for careful resource management. To Inca theology, it made perfect sense. The body of the sun's son was renewed each day, and so was its covering. There was no question of reuse. The Akala, while we are on the subject, were a kind of state monastic order for women. Girls of exceptional appearance, character, or skill were selected by imperial officials at around the age of 10, removed from their home communities, and gathered into closed institutions where they were taught weaving, ceremonial knowledge, the preparation of sacred chicha, and the various arts of court service. Some were eventually given as wives to nobles or to favoured officials as a form of imperial reward. Some served the temples for life. Some entered the personal service of the emperor himself. The system was, in its own way, the female counterpart to the male meter, except that it was permanent. Once an Akala, always an Akala. The palaces the Sapa Inca lived in were themselves treated almost as living entities. Each emperor built his own palace during his lifetime, with its own court, its own staff, its own farmland, its own herds, its own stores of cloth and gold, and its own religious endowments. He lived in this palace during his reign. He held court in it, he received tribute in it, he fathered his children in it, and then, when he died, something happened that is among the most peculiar arrangements of any major civilization in the historical record. He did not leave. His body was carefully preserved. The technique was a combination of mummification by drying in the cold mountain air and treatment with herbs and resins that prevented decay. The Andean climate, particularly at high altitude, is unusually kind to preserved bodies. Spanish observers who encountered surviving royal mummies in the 1530s wrote, with audible disbelief, that the kings looked as though they had been freshly bathed and clothed. The skin still attached to the bone, the features still recognizable. After preservation, the mummy was dressed in fine royal cloth, seated on a litter, and returned to its palace. It was not buried, it was not entombed, it was kept. The dead emperor's household continued to function. His wives, who had not joined him in death, remained in the palace. His servants kept their posts. His attendants prepared meals, which were ceremonially offered to him, and then, in practice, distributed to the staff. His advisers kept their offices. His estates kept producing crops and textiles and gold, which were brought to the palace and used to maintain the entire establishment in something close to its original style. The mummy was carried in procession during major festivals, sometimes for hundreds of kilometres, to take part in ceremonies in the company of other royal mummies. He sat at meals. He attended council. When important decisions affecting the dynasty were made, his descendants spoke for him, consulting his preserved opinion through specialist mediums who claimed to hear him. There are Spanish accounts describing imperial gatherings in Cusco, at which a row of mummified former emperors was set up in seats of honour along one wall of a great hall, each with his retinue standing behind him, each apparently included in the conversation. To the Spanish witnesses, this was either deeply uncanny or comically absurd, depending on the chronicler. To the Inca, it was simply how state business was conducted. The institution that managed all of this was called the Panea. A Paneca was the corporate descent group of a single past emperor. It consisted of all his descendants except for the one who had become his successor on the throne. It owned everything the emperor had owned in life, including his palace, his lands, his herds, his stores, and his right to receive tribute from the estates he had personally conquered. The Paneca's job was to keep its founder alive in the ritual sense, to feed him, clothe him, advise him, defend his honour, perform the festivals he had ordained, and ensure that his memory and his property remained intact for as long as the empire endured. Now, take a step back and look at what this arrangement implied for any new emperor who took the throne. The successor inherited the title, he inherited the office, he inherited the army, the priesthood, the bureaucracy, the loyalty of the regional governors. What he did not inherit was the wealth of his predecessor. The palaces, the lands, the herds, the gold, the textile workshops, the conquered estates, all of it remained the property of the dead emperor and his Paneca. The dead emperor was, in a perfectly legal and theologically correct sense, still the owner. He just happened to be no longer breathing. This system is known to historians as split inheritance, and once you see what it does, you cannot stop seeing it. Every new Sapa Inca came to power as effectively an upstart with a title. He had no estates of his own. He had no palace of his own. He had no independent income. Everything that had belonged to his father, even his father's recent and lucrative conquests, now belonged to his father's Panesa, and to the brothers and uncles and cousins who served as his father's caretakers. To live in a manner befitting a living god, to build his own palace, to maintain his own household, to support his own armies and his own retainers, and to provide for his own Paneca after his eventual death, the new emperor needed wealth. Vast quantities of it. There was, conveniently, exactly one way to acquire that wealth, and the imperial constitution made it easy. He conquered. He went to war. He marched his armies into a new province, absorbed it into the empire, and declared its land, its labour, and its tribute to be the personal property of the new throne. Until he died, at which point his own Panaka would inherit it all, and his successor would have to do exactly the same thing all over again. The system, in other words, was structurally addicted to expansion. The economy did not just benefit from conquest, it required conquest. A Sapa Inca who failed to expand was a Sapa Inca without resources, without prestige, and without the means to provide for his own afterlife. To stop conquering was, in effect, to commit dynastic suicide, so every new ruler conquered, and every one of his successors had to conquer further, and every Paneca, once founded, was a permanent drag on the empire, sitting on enormous estates that could never be reabsorbed into the imperial pool, eating into the productive land of the empire generation by generation, as more and more territory became locked up in the perpetual maintenance of mummified former rulers. For about a century this worked. The Andes are big. There was always somewhere new to conquer, and the empire's logistical machine was good enough to keep absorbing fresh provinces, scrambling their populations through the relocation system, and turning their tribute streams over to the latest ruler's household. But by the early 16th century, the empire was running out of profitable directions in which to expand. To the north, the jungles of what is now Colombia presented stubborn resistance and very little reward. To the south, the deserts of Chile petered out into territory where the cost of conquest exceeded any plausible benefit. To the east, the Amazon basin swallowed Inca armies the way wet sponges swallow water. To the west was the Pacific Ocean, which is, even by Inca standards, difficult to absorb into a tribute structure. The 11th Sapa Inca, a man called Huayna Capac, who would be the last clearly remembered emperor of the unified empire, spent most of his long reign pushing the northern frontier into Ecuador and southern Colombia. He campaigned for years. He built a second northern capital, the city of Quito, almost as a parallel to Cusco. He fathered a large family in the north. He kept the expansionary machine running through sheer personal energy. But the marginal returns of empire were dropping. Each new province absorbed cost more in soldiers and supplies and time than the last. The structural pressure that had once driven Inca armies to easy victories in fat valleys full of compliant farmers now drove them into jungle standoffs and desert sieges. This was, on its own, a manageable problem. Empires hit their natural limits. The Romans did, the Han did, the Achaemenids did. When you can no longer grow profitably, you find ways to consolidate what you have. The Inca, in fact, were beginning to do exactly that. Huayna Capac was investing heavily in administration, in infrastructure, in the integration of conquered peoples, in the kind of slow, careful work of holding what you have rather than constantly grabbing more. Given a few more decades, the empire might have transitioned out of its expansionary phase and settled into something more sustainable. It would not get those decades. Because while Huayna Capac was personally directing campaigns in the northern jungles, supervising the construction of new palaces in Quito, and considering the question of how to manage an empire that had grown almost too large for any one man to oversee, something invisible was already moving south along his beautifully maintained roads. Something he had never heard of. Something nobody on his entire continent had heard of. Something that did not respect Quipu, did not honour the Sapa Inca's divinity, did not negotiate with his nobility, and did not care about the careful protocols of empire. It came on the wind, and on hands, and on breath, and on the bodies of traders who had themselves caught it from other traders who had caught it from yet others, in a chain of contagion that stretched all the way north to where another set of strangers had recently arrived from across an unimaginable sea. The four parts joined together were about to meet a thing that did not care about parts at all. It was a virus. Specifically, it was variola, the smallpox virus, although nobody in the Andes would have a word for it for another century at least. It belonged to a family of pathogens that had been circulating in the human populations of Eurasia and Africa for thousands of years, long enough that European, North African and Asian populations had built up partial herd immunity through generation after generation of repeated exposure. People still died of smallpox in those places. People died of it in horrifying numbers, in fact. But enough people survived in each generation, with antibodies in their blood and scars on their faces, that the disease tended to circulate as a fact of childhood rather than as a wave of annihilation. The peoples of the Americas had no such immunity. Their ancestors had crossed into the continent during the last ice age, by way of the Bering Land Bridge, in a small founding migration that did not bring smallpox with it. Whatever pathogens those early arrivals carried did not include variola. For roughly 15,000 years afterward, every human being on two enormous continents lived in a population that had never met smallpox. Their immune systems had no template for it. When the virus eventually arrived, it would not encounter the resistance it found in Europe. It would encounter instead a vast pool of human bodies that did not know how to recognize the threat, did not know how to mount a defense, and could not, in any reasonable sense, survive its first introduction. The disease arrived in the Americas in 1518, in a Spanish settlement on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. From there it moved with the conquistadors of Hernán Cortés to mainland Mexico, where it tore through the Aztec Triple Alliance during the wars of the early 1520s with such devastating effect that historians still debate how much of the Spanish conquest of central Mexico was strictly military and how much was epidemiological. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, fell to a Spanish-led coalition in 1521. The Aztec emperor's immediate predecessor on the throne, a man named Cuitlahuac, had died of the disease in office, only weeks after taking it over from his fallen brother. The pattern of the New World was already being set, and the Inca had no way of knowing it. From central Mexico, the disease moved south. It travelled by trader, by porter, by walking refugee. It moved along the existing indigenous networks of communication that crisscrossed the lowlands of Central America, then jumped down the spine of the isthmus, into what is now Panama, then south into the territory the Inca called Chinchasuyu, the northern quarter of the empire. There is no clear record of how exactly it crossed the formal Inca frontier. There did not need to be. A single infected person, walking into a tambo on the northern roads and being given a place to sleep, was sufficient. We are not entirely certain what year it arrived. The best modern estimates place the first epidemic in the empire somewhere between 1524 and 1527. We are not even completely certain that the first disease was smallpox, although it almost certainly was. The Spanish chroniclers, who later collected oral testimony from Inca survivors, described a pestilence that matched smallpox symptoms closely. High fever, aching joints, then the rash. The painful pustules covering every centimetre of skin, including the inside of the throat and the membranes of the eyes. The horror of survivors who emerged disfigured. The mass losses in towns and villages where most of the population fell ill in the same week, and there was no one well enough to bring water to the sick. Some scholars have suggested that the first wave may have included a combination of diseases, with smallpox at its core and measles and influenza riding alongside. The result would have been roughly the same. Huayna Capac was in the northern campaigns when the news of the pestilence reached him. Different chroniclers tell slightly different versions of the next several months. The shared core of the story is that the emperor, by then in his 50s or possibly older, was in his northern capital of Quito, or somewhere near it, and that the new disease tore into his court and household over a matter of weeks. The court physicians, who were skilled herbalists working with one of the most sophisticated botanical pharmacies in the world, had no idea what they were treating. Nothing in their training prepared them for it. The plants that worked for fever did not stop this fever. The treatments that worked for skin infections did not heal these pustules. People fell ill and kept falling ill. Huayna Capac himself was struck down. The chronicles describe him going into a fever, becoming delirious, speaking strange words, recovering briefly enough to give some instructions to his court, then slipping away. Estimates of his death year range from 1524 to 1528, depending on the source. The most commonly accepted figure is around 1527 to 1528. His designated heir, a prince named Ninan Kuyochi, succumbed to the same disease within a few weeks, possibly within days. The throne had been prepared with a clean and obvious line of succession. The new emperor had been picked, trained, and presented to the nobility. He outlived his father by an interval so short that the imperial machinery, by some accounts, was still preparing the coronation rituals when the news arrived that the coronation would not, in fact, be happening. There were, by some accounts, omens. The chronicles collected by later Spanish writers from Inca informants include a recurring set of signs that were said to have appeared in the years before the emperor's death, and were understood, after the fact, as warnings. A great comet had been seen in the sky over the northern empire, a green-tailed visitor that moved against the stars for several nights, and was interpreted by the court astronomers as a portent of imperial death. A lightning strike had hit one of Huayna Capac's own palaces and burned through an entire wing. Eagles had been seen falling from the sky over Cusco, dropped by smaller birds that mobbed them in numbers no living priest could remember witnessing. A great earthquake had shaken the central highlands. The sea had risen and fallen along the coast in ways that older fishermen could not account for. Whether any of these things actually happened in the years described, or whether they were retroactively assembled into a coherent omen narrative by people trying to make sense of what came afterward, is one of those questions that historians have learned to hold gently. Either way, the educated classes of the empire believed after the catastrophe that the signs had been there to see, and that the priesthood had failed to read them in time. There was also the persistent later claim that Huayna Capac himself, on his deathbed, had spoken of strangers who would come from the sea and would change everything. Whether he actually said such a thing, or whether the chroniclers found it satisfying to imagine that the last great emperor had at least suspected the future, is again one of those points where the historian shrugs. There was now no emperor. There was no clear successor. There were, however, a great many other sons of Huayna Capac, scattered across the empire, each with his own faction of supporters within the nobility, each with his own potential claim. And, almost as devastatingly, there were now a great many fewer noble advisors, governors, generals, priests, and high officials than there had been a year earlier. The same epidemic that took the emperor had taken a substantial portion of the people who would have been needed to settle the succession smoothly. Counting losses in a virgin soil epidemic is a grim and somewhat impossible exercise. The estimates for the first wave through the Inca world range widely. Conservative scholars put the toll at 30 to 50% of the affected population. Less conservative ones put it as high as 90% in some regions. The actual number, whatever it was, is staggering either way. We are talking about millions of people, in a population that the empire could not afford to lose, concentrated in the worst possible parts of the imperial structure. The roads then did what we already feared they would do. The Chasqui network carried the contagion at the same sprint speed it had carried imperial orders. The runner delivering news of the emperor's illness was, sometimes, the runner delivering the illness itself. Because everything depended on the central administration, the loss of administrators mattered far more than it would have in a less centralized system. In the Inca world, none of that was true. There was only the central system and its appointed representatives, and when a substantial slice of them suddenly died in the space of a few months, the system stopped knowing what its own remaining population was doing. This is one of the most consistently underappreciated points about the collapse to come. The empire did not break because the Spanish were better fighters. The empire broke because by the time the Spanish arrived, half of its own administrators were already dead, and the survivors did not have current records of where the surviving population was, what they had, or what they owed. The Quipu archives still existed, but the people who could read them with full fluency, the senior keepers of the knots who held the institutional memory of how the strings were to be interpreted in any given province, had been disproportionately taken in the first wave. The system depended on living human memory, and a great deal of living human memory had been quietly deleted. For about a year after the death of Huayna Capac and his designated heir, the empire ran on inertia. The regional governors continued to do their jobs as best they could remember. The army garrisons stayed in place. The runners continued to carry messages, although fewer of them, and to fewer surviving recipients. The harvest came in. The granaries opened and closed on the same schedule. The mummies of the former emperors continued to be carried in procession and consulted by their panakas. To a casual observer, the empire looked intact. The disease, meanwhile, did not stop with one wave. There appear to have been at least 2 further outbreaks, possibly 3, in the years between the first epidemic and the arrival of Pizarro. Some of these were probably renewed waves of smallpox striking populations that had not yet been exposed. Others may have been different illnesses entirely, including measles and influenza, which followed the same trade and contact routes as variola, and which were, for an immunologically naive population, almost as lethal. The chroniclers did not distinguish carefully between diseases, and modern researchers can only guess at the exact mix from descriptions of symptoms. The point, for our purposes, is that the demographic and administrative damage was not a single blow followed by recovery. It was a series of blows, each one falling on a society that had not finished absorbing the previous one. Villages that had reorganized their fields after losing a third of their population in 1525 lost another fifth in 1530. Mid-level officials promoted to fill the gaps left by the first epidemic were themselves taken by the second. The depth of the demographic shock kept renewing itself. It was not intact. It was a building whose framework was still in place after the bracing had been knocked out, and gravity was just beginning to do its quiet work. The succession question now had to be settled. The 2 strongest candidates, almost by default, were 2 of Huayna Capac's surviving sons. One was Huascar. Huascar was the son of the principal queen, Huayna Capac's official primary wife, and his claim was based on what we might call the conservative interpretation of legitimacy. He had been born in Cusco. He had grown up in the imperial heartland. He had close ties to the old panakas of the southern empire, the dynastic kin groups of past emperors who held their traditional power bases in the area around the capital. By the standard rules of inheritance, with the elder designated heir gone, the throne should pass to him. The other was Atahualpa. Atahualpa was also a son of Huayna Capac, but his mother was a noblewoman from the recently conquered northern territories around Quito, and he had grown up in the north, at his father's side in the field, surrounded by the army that had spent decades fighting to absorb that region into the empire. He had been a favourite of his father's. He had been raised in the company of the empire's senior generals. He had been given administrative responsibilities in the northern campaigns. He was, in temperament and experience, the closer of the 2 to his father's actual habits of command. His claim to the throne was less procedural and more substantive. He had the loyalty of the army. He had the loyalty of the northern provinces. He had, by some accounts, an explicit blessing from his father to govern the north as a kind of co-monarch. The exact details of what Huayna Capac had wanted in his last fevered hours are unknowable. Different chronicles report different things. Some say the dying emperor had named both sons as joint successors, with Huascar to rule the south from Cusco and Atahualpa to rule the north from Quito. Some say he had named only Huascar, with Atahualpa retained as a senior governor under his brother. Some say he had named only Atahualpa. Some say he had named neither and had slipped away too quickly to make any clear decision. What is reasonably clear is that, whatever he said or did not say, the empire's political class divided sharply on the question of which son was the rightful Sapa Inca, and that division mapped onto a deeper geographic split that the empire had been carrying for a generation. For roughly 2 years, the brothers maintained an uneasy peace. Huáscar was crowned in Cusco. He took the Mascai Pacha, the red woolen fringe that was the actual physical symbol of imperial office, and the other ceremonial regalia. He performed the rituals. He was, in the formal sense, the new Sapa Inca. Atahualpa, in the north, did not formally challenge his brother's title. He did, however, continue to control the northern army, declined to come to Cusco to swear loyalty in person, and conduct himself in Quito as a head of state rather than a subordinate governor. He sent gifts and acknowledgements south. He did not send himself. In a stable empire, this kind of low-grade insubordination would have been resolved by the seated emperor marching north with his own army and forcing the issue. In the post-plague Inca world, several factors made this much more complicated than it should have been. First, the army that mattered most was Atahualpa's. The empire's most experienced veteran units, hardened by years of campaigning on the northern frontier, were stationed near Quito under the command of generals personally loyal to Atahualpa and to his late father. The forces available to Huáscar in Cusco were respectable, but they were not the same caliber and had not seen serious combat in years. They were the Imperial Guard, the ceremonial garrisons, the levies of the southern provinces. They knew their drill. They had not lately been fighting anyone. Second, Huáscar had managed, with what one can only politely describe as a striking absence of political instincts, to alienate the very nobility he most needed. He inherited a court of cousins, uncles, and the heads of the old Panacas, and within a year of taking the throne he had picked quarrels with most of them. He insulted the Panacas openly, accusing them of holding too much wealth, of acting as states within the state, and of forgetting that the new emperor was the actual living son of Inti, and therefore deserving of their full devotion rather than their merely polite attendance. He proposed, in one episode that survives in several chronicles, that the mummies of the former emperors should be removed from their palaces, stripped of their estates, and quietly buried, because their continued upkeep was draining the imperial economy. There was actually a great deal of truth in his complaint. The Panica system was, as already discussed, a structural drag on the empire's finances, and reforming it would have been a sensible move for any monarch. Suggesting that the dynasty's mummified ancestors be dispossessed, however, was not the most diplomatic way to open the conversation, and Huáscar's relatives took it about as well as you would expect. By 1530 or so, the cold conflict between the brothers turned hot. Different sources give different starting points and different sequences of opening engagements. The broad shape is clear enough. Atahualpa's generals, the most prominent of whom were Chalcochimac, Quizquiz, and Ruminawi, began campaigning south. They were professional soldiers. They had spent decades in the field. They knew their craft. Huáscar's commanders, drawn from the southern nobility, were less seasoned. The early battles, predictably, went poorly for the south. There were perhaps half a dozen major engagements, fought across hundreds of kilometres of mountain terrain. The names of the battles are preserved by the chroniclers, although the details are murky. There was a fight at Mocha. There were engagements around Ambato. The southern army won some early skirmishes by sheer weight of numbers. The northern army won the strategic battles by superior tactics and superior coordination. Cities changed hands. Whole regions declared for one side or the other. The empire's beautiful road network, again, played its quietly catastrophic role, moving armies and supplies and messages between the warring parties at exactly the speed needed to keep the conflict spreading. The damage was on multiple levels. On one level, there was the obvious damage of any war. Settlements were emptied, granaries were drained, fields were trampled by passing columns, roads were blockaded by partisans on both sides, tribute streams ceased to flow. The relay runner network was disrupted across the contested zones, although it still operated within each side's secured territory. Whole provinces saw their men of fighting age conscripted, their stores commandeered, their elites caught between competing demands for loyalty. The coastal city of Tumbes, in the far northwest of the empire, took particularly heavy damage during the early phases of the conflict, reduced from a thriving port and ceremonial centre to a battered shadow of itself. Anyone who had visited Tumbes in the prosperous years of Huayna Capac would not have recognised the place by 1532. On a deeper level, there was the damage to the imperial elite itself. The civil war was, among other things, a slow erasure of the old aristocracy. The Northern Army, when it advanced into the southern heartland, did not treat captured nobles with the kind of courtly restraint that imperial wars between Andean states had historically observed. Atahualpa's generals were operating in what they saw as a campaign to break the existing power structure of Cusco entirely. Captured Huascar loyalists were dealt with harshly, captured Panica members were removed, whole noble households were dispossessed and dispersed, sometimes including children, with the explicit intention of preventing any future revival of opposition to the northern faction. The old web of Panaca politics, with its hundreds of interlocking aristocratic families holding ancestral estates and ceremonial offices, was being torn apart by the very people who, in any other generation, would have been part of it themselves. The cumulative effect was a society shaken so badly that its surface was beginning to crack in ways that would not be repaired even in peacetime. The Empire of the Four Parts had spent a century carefully knitting itself together, absorbing local populations, scrambling them through the relocation policy, knitting them again under imperial Quechua and imperial gods. The civil war was now unpicking those knots in front of everyone, with the unsettling fact that the people doing the unpicking were the same people who had originally tied them. The decisive engagement came in early 1532, on the plain near a place called Cupaypan, not far from Cusco itself. Huascar by this point had taken to the field personally, leading what was left of his southern army. He was a courageous man by most accounts, although courage in the absence of strategy is its own kind of liability. His army outnumbered Atahualpa's forces, but his army was also exhausted, badly led, and increasingly demoralized by a string of recent defeats. The northern generals were patient. They drew Huascar's forces into a poor position. They struck from multiple directions. The southern army broke. Huascar himself was taken alive on the battlefield. The northern victory was now complete in military terms, but Atahualpa was, at this point, hundreds of kilometers away, recovering from his own campaigns at a hot spring resort near the town of Cajamarca. He had been delegating the actual fighting to his generals in the manner of a confident chief executive who lets his most capable subordinates handle the field operations. The news of Huascar's capture reached him at the hot springs, almost certainly carried by the relay runners that had served his ancestors, in the early months of 1532. He had won. He was, as of that moment, the unchallenged Sapa Inca of the Empire of the Four Parts joined together. The treatment of the defeated brother in the month that followed gives a useful sense of just how thoroughly the older rules of imperial conduct had broken down. Huascar was kept alive, but he was not kept comfortable. He was led in chains on a long march northward, displayed to crowds along the route as a captured rival, paraded past the very communities that had earlier sworn loyalty to him. The generals who had captured him took the opportunity to settle accounts in Cusco itself. They entered the city, accepted its surrender, and proceeded to dismantle what remained of the Huascar faction with a thoroughness that shocked even later northern chroniclers, who otherwise had every reason to portray their own side favourably. Huascar's wives, his children, his uncles, his closest cousins, his advisors, and the senior members of the Panayers that had supported him were systematically eliminated from public life. Some of his most prominent supporters were physically removed. Others were stripped of office and reduced to private status. The royal mummies of the Panacas that had backed him were, in some accounts, themselves treated with disrespect, with sacred objects redistributed and ancestral palaces taken over by new occupants loyal to the northern faction. To desecrate the mummies of past emperors was, by the older imperial theology, very nearly an act of blasphemy. The fact that Atahualpa's generals felt comfortable doing it tells you something about how far the empire had drifted from its own original ideological foundations in the space of a single bad decade. He had also inherited an empire that was, on closer inspection, a wreck. The civil war had taken perhaps another 100,000 lives on top of whatever the plague had taken before it. Major cities had been damaged or destroyed. The bureaucracy was in chaos, its regional structures often staffed now by survivors of 2 consecutive catastrophes who had no clear sense of who their superiors were or what the chain of command looked like. Tumbes lay in ruins. The Cusco nobility had been gutted. The Panacas were in mourning, in shock or in hiding, with many of their senior members gone and their estates uncertain. The old machinery of the empire was still nominally in place. the same way the skeleton of a tree is still in place after lightning has hollowed it from the inside. From a distance, in a particular light, it looked like a tree. Atahualpa, in Cajamarca, was preparing to do what any new emperor would have done in his position. He was assembling his court, planning his ceremonial entry into Cusco, organizing the consolidation of the surviving Huascar faction under his sole authority, and beginning the slow work of putting the empire back together under one ruler. He had with him a substantial army, his veteran generals, his personal staff, his priests, his concubines, his treasury, and the inherited authority of 1,000 rituals that defined him as the living sun. He intended, by all reasonable expectations, to rule for 30 or 40 years, restore the empire, expand the frontiers further, and reseat the dynasty on a stable footing. What he did not have, in any meaningful sense, was a sense that anything was about to change. There had been rumours for some time of strange men with pale skin and beards arriving on the northern coast. A small reconnaissance group had been reported. There had been a brief landing at Tumbes during the Civil War, with a handful of foreigners who had spent some time observing the city and had then departed again. To Atahualpa, sitting at the hot springs, dispatches about a few dozen oddly dressed foreigners on the coast did not register as a significant strategic problem. His advisers agreed. There were perhaps 200 of them, by the most generous estimates. They had peculiar animals with them, larger than llamas. They carried strange weapons of polished metal. They had asked, through interpreters, for permission to travel inland and meet him. They were, in his estimation, a curiosity to be examined when convenient. They were not a threat. And then, into this situation, walked the man who would, with a remarkable lack of grace, finish the job. His name was Francisco Pizarro. He was a Spanish soldier from Extremadura, illegitimately born, illiterate to his last day, in his 50s when he landed on the South American coast, and possessed of the kind of patience and ruthlessness that the conquest of empires has historically tended to reward. He had spent his earlier life in the Caribbean and in Panama, accumulating a modest fortune, hearing the persistent rumours of a great kingdom of gold somewhere to the south, and slowly putting together expeditions to find it. The first two had failed. The third was about to succeed beyond his most lurid expectations, although he did not yet know that. He landed on the Ecuadorian coast in 1531. He had with him a force of roughly 170 men, of whom about 160 would still be available when the time came for the meeting that mattered. He had horses, although not many. He had firearms, although fewer than a dozen. He had armour of Toledo steel. He had crossbows. He had the experience of veterans who had fought in the Caribbean Wars, the Italian Wars, and in some cases alongside the recent campaigns in central Mexico. He had no map of the empire he was about to invade. He had no diplomatic instructions from his king beyond the broad authorization to claim whatever he could for the Spanish crown. He had no clear plan. He had, in his head, only the simple working belief that there was gold inland, that the rumours of a kingdom were true, and that he was the man to find it. He spent most of 1531 and the first half of 1532 moving cautiously down the Ecuadorian coast and into northern Peru. He stopped at Tumbes, the ruined city, and found it half empty. He set up a base. He gathered intelligence. He learned, through translators picked up on earlier expeditions, that the empire was in the middle of a civil war, that one of the two rival brothers had recently triumphed, and that the new Sapa Inca was at that moment relaxing at a hot spring resort some distance inland. He weighed the information, and then, in September of 1532, he made the most consequential decision of his career. He decided to go and meet Atahualpa in person. He started inland with his small force, climbing up the Inca road network into the highlands, moving along beautifully paved stretches of imperial highway that had been built for armies many times the size of his. He was treated at first with curiosity and a kind of grudging hospitality. Local officials provided supplies. Local nobles came to inspect the foreigners. Messages flew back and forth between his column and Atahualpa's court. Atahualpa, when he heard about the small foreign group climbing up his roads, considered briefly whether to send a force to brush them off. He decided instead to invite them to Cajamarca. He had at that moment an army of approximately 80,000 men in the immediate vicinity of the town. He saw no reason to be concerned. To understand what happened next, we have to spend some time inside the heads of two men who, separately, were both making the worst possible decision they could have made under the circumstances. The fact that one of them got lucky and the other did not has, for 5 centuries, made it easy to look back and assign genius to the winner and foolishness to the loser. The truth is messier. Both men were making bets with extremely poor information. Both bets were nearly insane on their own terms. One of them paid off, and the other ended in disaster, by margins so thin that historians still argue about which factor mattered most. Let us start with Pizarro's bet, because the geography arrives at it first. The road from the coast to Cajamarca climbed through the western foothills of the Andes for several weeks of difficult marching. The Spanish column moved slowly. Pizarro had with him, by the time he reached the highlands proper, somewhere between 160 and 170 men, around 60 horses, a few small cannons, a handful of harquebuses, early firearms that took roughly a minute to reload and frequently failed to fire at all, and an assortment of crossbows, swords, daggers, lances, and steel armour. He had translators, including a young man named Felipillo from the coastal region, who had been picked up on an earlier voyage and who spoke a coastal dialect of Quechua. He had 2 friars with him, including a Dominican named Vicente de Valverde, who would have his own peculiar role to play in the next several days. The route he took climbed through several mountain passes at altitudes between 3,000 and 4,000 metres. The Spanish, fresh from sea level, suffered. Altitude sickness affected the horses badly. The trail itself, paved with cut stone in the imperial style, with bridges and provisioned rest stops at regular intervals, was actively cooperating with their advance. The Empire's road system was, in effect, giving the foreign invader a free, well-engineered, well-supplied highway directly into the interior. At every way station, the local officials, operating under whatever orders had been most recently issued from the imperial court, provided food and lodging. Atahualpa in Cajamarca had personally instructed that the foreigners be allowed to proceed without obstruction. He wanted to see them in person, and he saw no reason to make the journey difficult for them. Several times during the climb, Pizarro's officers later admitted men in the column had nearly turned back. The route was difficult. The thin air at altitude left them gasping. The cold at night was brutal for men accustomed to the tropics, and every passing day brought new and more alarming intelligence about the size of the army waiting for them at the end of the road. The local nobles they met along the way, sensing perhaps that hospitality alone might not be enough to discourage the foreigners, made a point of mentioning the numbers. 40,000 soldiers, they said, 50,000, 60,000. The figures climbed each day as the column climbed further inland. It was, depending on how you looked at it, either polite information sharing or one of the more elegant forms of psychological warfare in the historical record. Pizarro kept going. There are 2 competing explanations for why he kept going, and like most competing historical explanations, both are probably partly correct. The first is that he had no choice. He had spent the last 15 years of his life and most of his personal fortune assembling the expedition. He had committed his men, his investors, and his reputation to the project of finding the rumoured kingdom of gold. To turn back at this point, with the kingdom literally over the next ridge, would have been to abandon the only chance he was ever going to get. Most of his men would have lost everything they had committed. His investors would have been ruined. He would have returned to Panama as the man who, having located the legendary Southern Empire, had then politely retreated from it. He was in his 50s. He was not going to get another expedition. The second explanation is theological. Pizarro was a soldier of his time, and his time believed, with a depth that is hard to recover today, that the Catholic God was actively present in human affairs. Like most Spanish veterans of the Caribbean and Central American campaigns, he had absorbed the lessons of the conquest of central Mexico, where a force of a few hundred men under another Extremaduran commander had defeated an empire of millions in slightly more than 2 years. The Spanish at the time understood that victory, perfectly sincerely as a sign of divine favour. God was on the side of the Christians. God had delivered the Aztec emperor into a Spanish hand. God would surely do the same for any Christian commander who held his nerve. To turn back now was therefore not only an economic disaster, it was a quiet act of faithlessness. A soldier who genuinely trusted in Providence did not turn around at the sight of a large pagan army. He kept walking. He held his cross. He waited to see what Providence would arrange. Both explanations are real. Both were operating in Pizarro's head at the same time, almost certainly without any clear distinction between them. He could not afford to retreat, and he believed God would not allow retreat. Those 2 ideas were, for him, the same idea. In mid-November of 1532 his column came over the last ridge and looked down into the valley of Cajamarca. What he saw on that ridge is one of those moments in history where you wish you had a camera. The Spanish chroniclers who wrote about it later all describe a similar scene, with small variations. The town of Cajamarca itself lay in a small valley, perhaps half a day's march below. It was a modest provincial centre with a central plaza, several stone buildings, and outlying agricultural settlements. The town was not what stopped them in their tracks. What stopped them was what lay on the slopes behind the town. The slopes were white. There were several thousand tents pitched across the hillsides above and beyond Cajamarca in disciplined rows, with cooking fires burning in front of them. The white cotton fabric of the tents, illuminated by the high mountain sun, gave the entire hillside the appearance of fresh snowfall. The Inca army was camped in formation around the imperial bath complex, where the emperor was staying, and the formation extended further across the landscape than any of the Spanish had ever seen a single army deployed before. One of the surviving Spanish accounts records, in unusually honest language, that several men in the column wept openly at the sight, that others fell to praying, and that nobody slept well that night. Estimates of the actual Inca strength vary. The most commonly cited figure is around 80,000 men, although this almost certainly included camp followers, servants, and supply personnel as well as combat soldiers. A more conservative breakdown puts the actual fighting strength at around 40,000, with another 40,000 in support roles. Either way, the Spanish were outnumbered by a factor of at least 250 to 1 in combatants, and significantly more in total personnel. There was no scenario, looking purely at the numbers, in which a frontal engagement could be won. Pizarro understood this clearly. So did every soldier in his column. The mood that evening was, by all later accounts, somewhere between grim and openly terrified, with the more religious of the men spending the night in confession with the two friars, and the more pragmatic spending it counting their crossbow bolts and quietly looking for the exits. Pizarro called a council of his officers. The question on the table was simple. Now what? There were essentially three options. The first was retreat. Turn around, go back down the road, get out of the highlands, return to the coast, and either go home or wait for reinforcements from Panama before trying again. The objection to retreat beyond the strategic and economic objections already mentioned was a tactical one. Retreating in front of an army that already knew you were here, on a road that the army's runners could shut behind you within hours, was probably not retreat. It was probably the start of being chased through the mountains by an enemy who knew every metre of the terrain better than you did. The road, that beautiful highway that had brought them up, would now be the only road available for the return trip. The Empire could and would close it. The second option was to dig in and fortify, take possession of Cajamarca, set up defensive positions in the central plaza, and wait. Wait for what exactly was not entirely clear, but the basic idea was to make themselves expensive to attack and hope something useful turned up. The objection to this option was that the Inca army could simply lay siege, cut off food and water, and starve the position out at its leisure. Cajamarca was not built as a fortress. It had a few stone walls. It did not have the kind of integrated defences that would have allowed 200 men to resist 80,000 for any meaningful length of time. The third option was attack. Specifically, the option Pizarro began to develop in those long council sessions was the option of striking before being struck. Not at the Inca army itself, which would have been suicidal in the straightforward sense, but at its head. The plan, in its essentials, was to lure the emperor into the central plaza of Cajamarca, where the Spanish would be hidden in the buildings around the square, and then to seize him personally in the presence of his unarmed escort before his army could intervene. Capture the emperor, hold him as a hostage, use him as leverage to negotiate or to control, or, if necessary, to ransom for whatever could be extracted from the imperial treasury. The model for this plan was, openly, the strategy that the conquistadors had used in Mexico 13 years earlier. The Spanish commander there had marched into the Aztec capital in 1519, secured himself as an honoured guest in the palace of the Emperor Moctezuma, and then quite suddenly and very calmly placed Moctezuma under arrest in his own court, using him afterward as a puppet to govern the empire through. That earlier operation had eventually broken down, with the Aztec capital exploding into rebellion and the Spanish being driven out for a year before they returned to finish the job. But the central insight had worked. Capture the God King. The system that worships him will not know what to do. Pizarro had been peripherally connected to the earlier campaign through old comrades and family contacts. He had heard, in detail, the story of how Moctezuma had been taken. He had absorbed the lessons, and the lessons told him that a small force, properly positioned, could indeed seize a god king if the god king walked into the wrong room. The question was how to get Atahualpa to walk into the wrong room. There was, as it happened, a wrong room available, and the geography of Cajamarca was almost embarrassingly cooperative. The central plaza of the town was a large rectangular space, perhaps a couple of 100 meters across in its longest dimension, paved in stone and bounded on 3 sides by long, low buildings with covered porticos. The 4th side opened onto the road that led out across the plain toward the imperial bath complex. The buildings around the plaza included storehouses, administrative offices, and what may have been a small temple. They had thick walls, narrow doorways, and interior spaces deep enough to conceal a number of men, with their horses out of sight from anyone standing in the square. There was only one entrance into the plaza of any meaningful size, the one from the road. Once a procession entered the plaza, it would have to either retreat back along the road it had come on, or fight its way through the buildings on the other sides. From a Spanish tactical perspective, the plaza was, almost embarrassingly, exactly the kind of enclosed killing ground that Mediterranean ambush doctrine had been designed for. The Inca, who had built it as a normal provincial administrative centre, had not built it with that purpose in mind. They had simply built a square the way provincial squares were built. They had no concept of cavalry ambush, because they had no cavalry, and they had no concept of why an open plaza with limited exits might suddenly become the most dangerous place in the world for an unarmed escort. Pizarro looked at the same plaza and saw something quite different. He saw a building whose floor plan was the answer to his problem. The first step was to invite him. Pizarro sent envoys. He chose 2 of his best officers for the job. The first was his younger half-brother, Hernando Pizarro, a tall, arrogant, well-dressed nobleman who looked the part of a Spanish grandee, and who could be relied upon to maintain his composure in any setting. The second was Hernando de Soto, who would later become famous in his own right as the leader of a long and disastrous expedition through what is now the southeastern United States. De Soto was an excellent horseman, an experienced cavalry commander, and the kind of officer who responded to dangerous situations by becoming, if anything, more relaxed and pleasant. They took with them around 20 mounted men, and the translator, Felipillo. They rode out across the plain that separated Cajamarca from the imperial bath complex, and they arrived at the emperor's encampment in the late afternoon. What followed is one of the strangest diplomatic meetings in recorded history, and worth describing carefully, because it explains a great deal about what came afterward. Atahualpa was in a small inner courtyard at the bath complex, seated on a low stool, attended by a substantial entourage of nobles and women of his court, with a quiet rank of armed bodyguards standing some distance away. He had recently been served chicha, the fermented maize beer of imperial ceremony, by women of his household. He was, by all later accounts, completely composed. The Spanish horsemen were brought into the courtyard. They dismounted. They were not permitted to approach the emperor directly. Hernando de Soto, through Felipillo, delivered the invitation. The Spanish commander wished to meet the great lord in person. He would be honoured to receive the emperor at the central plaza of Cajamarca the following day. Atahualpa did not respond immediately. He did not look up. He continued to gaze at the ground in the formal ritual posture appropriate for a god-king receiving lower beings. One of his senior advisers spoke on his behalf, communicating polite acknowledgements. There was a long pause. De Soto, by some combination of military instinct and personal vanity, decided this was the moment for a demonstration. He had brought his horse, a particularly responsive animal, into the courtyard. He mounted. He put the horse through a brief but spectacular display of close-quarters riding, charging it directly toward the emperor's seated position, and then pulling it up sharply at the last possible moment so that the animal's hooves nearly grazed the imperial garments. It was a calculated piece of theatre. The Spanish had already noticed that the Inca, who had no horses of their own, regarded the animals with a mixture of fear and fascination. De Soto wanted to plant the idea that these creatures and the men who rode them were not to be trifled with. Atahualpa did not flinch. This is one of the small moments that, in retrospect, told the Spanish everything they needed to know about him, and that they noticed at the time. The emperor did not look up. He did not pull back. He did not show any visible response to the horse, charging within a meter of his face. He continued to sit as he had been sitting, with his expression unchanged, and after a moment he addressed a quiet remark to one of his advisers and went on with whatever ritual posture his presence required. The Spanish chroniclers report with a kind of admiring discomfort that later that evening Atahualpa had several of his own guards executed for having flinched in the same moment when he had not. The standard expected of those serving the living son of the sun was absolute composure in any circumstance, and the guards had failed it in front of foreigners. They paid the price. To the Spanish, who had been hoping that the horse display would intimidate the emperor, this was a deeply unsettling piece of information. The man they were trying to scare did not scare. The men around him, who might have wavered, were being killed for having wavered. The imperial psychology was not going to be cracked by parlour tricks. He accepted the invitation, however. He would come to Cajamarca the following day. He would bring an honour guard, but not, he assured the envoys, an army. He would arrive with his court and his nobles. He wished to receive the foreigners properly with appropriate ceremony, as befitted his dignity. The Spanish should prepare to meet him in the central plaza. The envoys saluted. They mounted. They rode back to Cajamarca in the dusk. Felipillo himself was a coastal teenager with rough Spanish and a non-court dialect of Quechua, which meant that neither side could be entirely sure at any point what the other had actually said. The Emperor's bath complex, fed by natural hot springs, was a quiet inner garden retreat where he had been spending his post-war convalescence. While he soaked in heated stone pools planning his triumphal entry into Cusco, the men a few kilometres across the plain were sleeping in armour. Both sides believed completely that they were in command of the situation. Now we come to the deeper question, which is the question of why Atahualpa agreed to any of this. Why did he not, with one wave of a hand, order his army to walk down to Cajamarca and crush the foreign column in a single afternoon? He had the numbers, he had the position. He had the perfect tactical opportunity. He had every reason to act. The honest answer requires us to take seriously how the world looked from his point of view, and how unrecognisably different it was from the world Pizarro inhabited a few kilometres away. The emperor was, by his own deep and inherited understanding of reality, the living sun. He was the descendant of a god, raised in a palace, attended by women who would be executed if they spilled his wine, dressed each day in clothes that would be burned at sunset, and surrounded by a court that did not look at him. He had just won a long civil war. He had won it through generals personally loyal to him, against a brother whose body was at that very moment being held in chains somewhere on the imperial roads. He was about to ride into Cusco in triumph. The trajectory of his life, as he understood it, was one of unbroken ascending success. He was, in the deepest sense available to the Andean theological imagination, currently in favour with the universe. Into this picture walked 160 foreigners. They were strange. They had odd skin and odd hair. They rode large animals he had not seen before. They carried weapons of unfamiliar metal. They had asked, politely if rather presumptuously, for permission to meet him. They came from the coast, where the empire had always absorbed odd peripheral peoples by giving them roles in the imperial system, or, when that failed, by removing them. There had been a few earlier sightings of similar foreigners over the previous decade. They had not done anything particularly memorable on those earlier visits. They had asked questions, taken some objects, departed again. There was, from the perspective of an emperor at the peak of his powers, nothing especially alarming about the current group. They were, at most, a curiosity. At minimum, a small piece of pre-existing diplomatic business that he would now sort out personally. The idea that 160 foreigners could pose a serious threat to an army of 40 to 80,000 professional soldiers seems, at this remove, so self-evidently impossible that we have to keep reminding ourselves Atahualpa was actually correct about this in any normal accounting. On paper, the Spanish should not have been able to fight their way out of Cajamarca, let alone defeat the empire. Every modern military analyst who has looked at the matchup has concluded the same thing. The forces were absurdly mismatched. The emperor was not insane to assume the encounter posed no risk to him. He was working from accurate numbers. He just did not have all the variables. What he did not know, and could not have known without prior exposure, were the specific advantages the Spanish carried. He had not seen what a steel sword could do to quilted cotton armour at close quarters. He had not seen what a horse, used in shock cavalry charges against unarmoured infantry, could do in a confined space. He had not encountered black powder weapons of any kind. He did not understand, in any practical sense, that armour of polished steel made the body underneath very nearly impossible to wound with bronze-tipped spears or stone-edged clubs. He did not understand that a small group of mounted, armoured, steel-wielding men could, in certain narrow circumstances, neutralise unarmoured opponents at a ratio of 1 to 50 or 1 to 100 before fatiguing. He also did not understand the cultural variable, which was that the Spanish did not share his rules. He was operating, throughout this encounter, by the conventions of pre-Columbian Andean warfare, in which set-piece battles were fought between assembled armies in open terrain. Captured enemies could be reasonably expected to be ransomed or absorbed, and the person of a sovereign was treated even in defeat with elaborate ceremonial respect. The Spanish did not operate by these conventions. They operated by the conventions of medieval Mediterranean warfare, in which ambush, hostage-taking, surprise action, and the casual seizure of opposing leaders were all completely standard practice, and had been refined to high art during 8 centuries of religious and dynastic conflict in Iberia. A Spanish veteran, asked in 1532 whether it was acceptable to invite an enemy ruler to a ceremony and then take him captive, would have found the question slightly odd, in the way one would find the question of whether it was acceptable to use one's left hand. Of course it was acceptable. What else were you going to do with him? The two sides were, in a quite literal sense, playing different games on the same board. Atahualpa was playing the Andean game by Andean rules, and within those rules he was winning effortlessly. He was treating the Spanish with the studied disinterest of a powerful sovereign receiving a minor delegation. He was allowing them into his presence as a gesture of courtly hospitality. He was planning to greet them in person the next day, take their measure, find out what they wanted, and then absorb them into the imperial system in whatever role best suited his court. They would probably be made into a kind of curiosity household, kept near him for their oddness, their language, and their bizarre animals, with their leader given a minor noble title, and the rest distributed as servants among his most favoured advisers. This was a perfectly sensible plan within the rules he understood. Pizarro, on the same board, was playing the Iberian game by Iberian rules, and in his game the obvious move was a trap. Lure the king into a confined space, disperse the bodyguard, take the king, use him. Neither man could see the other's game clearly. Each man, looking at the other, saw a slightly absurd misunderstanding of the situation. Atahualpa saw a small group of impertinent foreigners who would be brought to heel by tomorrow evening. Pizarro saw a powerful but tactically naive ruler who could be neutralized in a single decisive stroke. The strange thing is that both of them were partly right. The man Atahualpa was looking at was indeed in over his head by every reasonable measure. The man Pizarro was looking at was indeed walking, without realizing it, into precisely the kind of trap the Mediterranean playbook had been refining for centuries. The evening of November 15th, 1532, the Spanish in Cajamarca finalized their plan. Pizarro divided his force into 3 sections. 2 cavalry units, of about 30 men each, were hidden in the buildings on opposite sides of the plaza, with the horses kept saddled and the riders armoured and ready. The remaining men, the infantry, the harquebusiers, and the 2 small cannons, were placed in similar concealed positions around the square. The entire force was hidden. The plaza, when the emperor arrived, would appear deserted. The signal to act would be a specific phrase, agreed upon in advance, delivered by Pizarro at the moment of his choosing. Until then, every man was to remain hidden and silent. Even the horses had been prepared, as much as preparing is a word that applies to horses to be kept calm. Their bells, which they usually wore for noise and ceremony, were removed for the night. The cavalry fitted small loud rattles to their saddles instead, intended to be activated only when they moved, with the goal of producing maximum psychological impact on a population that had never heard such sounds before. Pizarro spent the night going from position to position talking to his men. The chroniclers report, with what was probably some self-aware embellishment, the kinds of speeches a Spanish commander would have been expected to give on the eve of such an engagement. He reminded them of the holy nature of their enterprise. He reminded them that Christ would walk with them. He reminded them of the fame and the wealth that would follow a successful action. He also, more practically, reminded them that retreat was no longer an option, and that their best chance of survival was to commit fully to the plan and to move with maximum coordination at the agreed signal. He almost certainly did not sleep that night. Few of his men did. The hours between the late evening and dawn passed in the careful, slow, methodical preparation of an action that, by every reasonable measure of the world they knew, should not work. Across the plain, in the imperial bath complex, the emperor also did not sleep, although for entirely different reasons. He was preparing for a triumphal entrance. His attendants were assembling the litter that would carry him, an elaborate platform of finely worked wood inlaid with silver, with cushioned seats and roof posts hung with feathers. They were laying out the ceremonial garments. They were polishing the gold and silver discs that would be carried in procession ahead of him. They were assembling the dancers, the musicians, the singers, the priests, and the noble attendants who would form his honour guard. They were preparing the masque pacha, the red fringe of office, for him to wear at the formal moment of meeting. The procession was being staged as the entry of a god into a foreign reception. It was being designed to overwhelm the visitors with the dignity, beauty, and power of the imperial court. He had decided to bring with him, in addition to the ceremonial procession, several thousand attendants and lesser nobles. By the most common estimates, the entourage that accompanied him into Cajamarca the next afternoon numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people. They were not importantly armed for combat. They carried ceremonial weapons, decorative axes, and clubs of polished wood, but they were dressed in fine cloth rather than armour, and they were arranged for spectacle rather than for tactical positioning. The actual imperial army, the 40,000 or more soldiers who could have made any threat to the Spanish vanish in an afternoon, were left at the bath complex. They had no role in the day's plans. The emperor was going to receive guests. The army was not invited. This decision, more than any other, would shape the next century of Andean history. The reasoning behind it was, again, perfectly sound within the framework Atahualpa was using. A god-king does not enter a foreign reception flanked by his army. He enters flanked by his court. The army is for war. This was not war. This was a polite imperial inspection of a small and quaintly outlandish delegation. The army would only have made the foreigners more nervous than they already were, and the emperor wanted them to feel the proper awe of his presence, without the proper terror of his power. The terror would come later, in some private and much less ceremonious setting, if and when it was needed. For now, what was needed was dignity. He would arrive in the plaza in late afternoon. The light would be soft. The colours of his procession would be magnificent. He would receive the foreigners, he would assess them, he would probably allow them to depart for the night, and would meet with them again the next day in a more substantial discussion of what they wanted. The whole event was scheduled with the patient confidence of a man who had every reason to assume that the universe was going to continue arranging itself around his preferences. Across the empty plaza, behind walls and inside doorways, 160 Spanish soldiers waited, sweating in their armour, praying or refusing to pray, hands on their weapons, listening for the sound of approaching drums. The two men who were about to meet had spent the previous 3 days, and arguably their entire lives, building two completely different understandings of what was about to happen. They were both about to find out which of them had been correct. The morning of November 16th, 1532, dawned clear and cold over the valley of Cajamarca. The Spanish in their concealed positions had been awake for hours. They were already in armour, although helmets were not yet on, and the men were rotating in and out of the doorways to keep blood flowing in their legs. The horses, fitted with their new saddle rattles and with their hooves freshly checked, stood in the long interior spaces of the buildings, occasionally snorting at the cold air. Outside, in the plaza, the sun rose over the eastern ridge and warmed the stone slowly. Nothing moved. The first message from the imperial court arrived around midday. A runner came down from the bath complex to report that the emperor would be arriving sometime in the afternoon. He was preparing his procession. He sent his regards. He looked forward to receiving the foreigners with appropriate ceremony. Then nothing. The afternoon passed. The Spanish waited. The plaza remained empty. The temperature climbed. The men in the buildings sweated under their armour. The horses became restless. Pizarro, by all accounts, walked from position to position with the steady calm of a man who has decided that his fate is no longer in his own hands and has settled in consequence, into a kind of philosophical patience. A second message arrived in the late afternoon. The emperor had decided to delay his departure. He would now arrive closer to evening. He apologized for the change of schedule. He hoped this did not inconvenience his hosts. Some historians have argued that this delay was deliberate, a piece of subtle psychological pressure intended to remind the foreigners of their proper place in the diplomatic hierarchy. A sovereign arrives when he chooses to arrive. He does not arrive at the convenience of his inferiors. Other historians have argued that the delay was practical, that the procession was simply taking longer to assemble than anticipated, with thousands of attendants needing to be marshalled into the correct ceremonial order. Either way, the practical effect on the Spanish was punishing. They had been in position since before dawn. They were tired, hungry, and increasingly nervous. A second day of waiting in concealment, with no break for food and only minimal water, was beginning to test their discipline. Around 4 in the afternoon, the procession finally began to move out of the imperial bath complex and onto the road toward Cajamarca. It moved slowly. It was, by any modern standard, an enormous parade. Several thousand attendants, court officials, dancers, musicians, sweepers, lesser nobles and priests stretched along the road in carefully ordered ranks. The dancers and musicians went first. Behind them came men whose job was to sweep the road clean of any debris with brushes and small brooms. Then came nobles dressed in checkered tunics of red and white, then nobles in pure white, then nobles in pure red, each tier marking a level of seniority in the imperial court. Behind them, finally, came the emperor's personal litter, carried on the shoulders of 80 men of his closest service, with the polished wood and silver inlay reflecting the late afternoon light. The emperor himself sat under a canopy of feathers, dressed in fine vicuña wool, with the mascai pacha on his forehead, and heavy gold ornaments at his ears that, by Spanish description, hung almost to his shoulders. Behind the imperial litter came additional litters carrying senior nobles, then more attendants, then the rear guard of the court. The whole procession took several hours to cover the few kilometers from the bath complex to the outskirts of Cajamarca. The Spanish, watching from their concealed positions inside the town, could see the leading edge of it approaching across the plain through the late afternoon and into early evening. Singers and musicians moved in front with drums and panpipes producing a steady layered rhythm that one Spanish witness later described as the most beautiful and the most ominous sound he had ever heard. The procession halted at the edge of the town. Some accounts say that Atahualpa originally intended to make camp outside the walls for the night and enter Cajamarca only the next morning, partly as a further piece of ceremonial restraint and partly to allow a better scouting of the situation. Pizarro, hearing of this from a runner, came close to panic. The plan he had constructed depended on the meeting happening that evening, in conditions of his choosing. A delay would mean another night of his men hidden in their positions, with the very real risk that the discipline of the column would crack and the trap would be discovered. He sent a senior officer, a Spanish nobleman named Hernando de Aldana, to ride out to the procession and persuade the emperor to come into the plaza after all. Aldana, through Felipillo, conveyed an urgent invitation. The emperor's hosts were ready. They had prepared a reception. They would be deeply honoured if the great lord would enter the town tonight, as originally agreed. The emperor reconsidered. He decided that the ceremonial impact of a sunset entry into the foreign reception was, on reflection, the more impressive choice. He gave the order. The procession resumed its forward movement and began to flow into the central plaza of Cajamarca. The first attendants to enter the square were the sweepers. They came in measured rows, brushing the stone ahead of them in slow ritual sweeps. Behind them came the dancers, then the musicians, then the ranks of nobles in their tiered colours. The plaza, which had stood empty for the entire day, filled steadily as the procession poured into it. The unarmed attendants spread out across the open paved space, formed up in disciplined groups, and waited. The Spanish in the surrounding buildings, watching through cracks in the doors and through small windows, watched the plaza fill until there were perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 people standing in it, all of them in fine cloth, all of them unarmoured, all of them carrying ceremonial wooden axes and clubs rather than fighting equipment, all of them with their attention focused on the litter that was now entering the square at the rear of the procession. Atahualpa was carried into the plaza on the shoulders of his 80 bearers. He surveyed the empty square. He turned his head slowly. He noted that no Spanish were visible. He noted that no foreign commander was present to greet him with the courtesy his dignity required. He waited. To understand the strangeness of this moment, you have to picture it from his point of view. A god king has just entered a foreign plaza at the head of a brilliantly coloured procession of his entire court. The plaza is empty. There is no host. There is no greeting party. There is, in fact, no visible foreign presence at all. The buildings around the square are closed up, their doors shut, their windows dark. It looked, by any reasonable reading, as if the foreigners had fled before his arrival. This was either a remarkable insult or, more likely, evidence that the strangers had panicked at the approach of his court and abandoned the meeting. From Atahualpa's perspective, the day was beginning to look like a much shorter exercise than expected. He would receive their formal apology in the morning, perhaps in person, perhaps through messengers. He waited a moment longer, in case some Spanish official appeared. None did. It was at this moment that Vicente de Valverde stepped out of one of the buildings. The friar Valverde walked into the empty plaza alone, accompanied only by Felipillo as translator. He carried with him a small breviary, a Latin prayer book, which has often been described in later accounts as a Bible but was probably something more compact and portable. He approached the imperial litter at a respectful distance. He stopped. Through Felipillo he addressed the emperor. What he said and what was translated and what was actually understood by Atahualpa are three different things, and we are unlikely ever to know exactly where they overlapped. The standard Spanish account, written from Spanish memory and consequently from a Spanish frame of reference, runs roughly as follows. Valverde introduced himself as a friar of the Christian Church. He explained that the foreigners had come on behalf of the Spanish crown and on behalf of the true God. He explained in broad strokes the central claims of his religion. He asked the emperor to accept the Christian faith and to acknowledge the authority of the Spanish king. He extended the prayer book toward the emperor as a kind of sacred object, the physical embodiment of the religion he was inviting Atahualpa to consider. What the emperor heard, through Felipillo's imperfect translation, was probably something more compressed and considerably less coherent. A short man in dark robes was approaching him, holding a small object and speaking through a teenage translator about a god that the emperor had never heard of and a foreign king whose existence he had no reason to acknowledge. The whole scene was, by every imperial rule of court protocol, breathtakingly disrespectful. Valverde had walked into the presence of the living son of the sun without prostrating himself, without averting his eyes, without carrying the symbolic burden on his shoulders that even the highest nobles of the empire carried. He was standing upright. He was speaking directly. He was offering an object as if the emperor were the one who should be receiving instruction. Atahualpa, by various accounts, reached down from his litter and accepted the object. He turned it over in his hands. He examined it. Some accounts say he held it to his ear, as if trying to listen to it, since Andean sacred objects were often understood to speak in their own ways. Hearing nothing, he opened it. He looked at the marks inside the pages. The marks meant nothing to him. They were patterns of ink on a foreign material, conveying a system of communication that did not exist in his world. He held the book briefly, and then, with what the Spanish later described as a gesture of mild irritation, and what was probably, from his point of view, a perfectly reasonable response to being handed an incomprehensible object, he let it drop. The book fell to the paving stones of the plaza. Valverde, in the Spanish telling, recoiled in something like horror. The sacred book of the Christian God had been thrown to the ground by a pagan king. Whether this constituted, in the strict theological sense, a genuine rejection of the faith or simply the natural reaction of a man handed an object he could not read, the friar interpreted it the way the situation required him to interpret it. He turned and hurried back toward Pizarro's position. He called out. He said something to the effect that the gospel had been rejected and that the time had come to act. Pizarro had been waiting for an excuse. He now had one. He gave the signal. The signal was a single shot from a small cannon mounted in one of the buildings on the edge of the plaza. The cannon fired into the densely packed crowd. At almost the same moment, the harquebusiers along the surrounding walls discharged their weapons. The combined sound was unlike anything the Andean ear had ever encountered. It was louder than thunder, closer than thunder, and accompanied by smoke, fire, and an immediate physical impact in the crowd that no one in the plaza could explain. The first reaction was a kind of frozen silence, lasting perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, as several thousand people processed simultaneously that something completely outside their experience had just happened. Then the cavalry came out of the buildings. The horses had been kept calm throughout the long day in their hidden positions. They were now released into the plaza in 2 coordinated charges from opposite corners, with the small rattles on their saddles activated to produce the maximum possible noise. The riders, in full steel armour with lances and swords drawn, drove their mounts directly into the densest concentrations of people. The Spanish chronicle accounts emphasize the psychological effect of this moment more than the physical one. The Andean crowd had no framework for understanding what was happening. They had never seen mounted men. They had never heard the combined noise of cannon, harquebus, hooves on stone, and metal rattles. They had never been at the receiving end of cavalry deployed as shock weapons against unarmored civilians in an enclosed space. The plaza, designed to be a place of orderly imperial reception, became within seconds a place of complete sensory overload, with no usable exit for the thousands of attendants packed inside it. The actual military action was, by any honest accounting, a one-sided operation rather than a battle in any meaningful sense. The Inca attendants were ceremonial personnel dressed for diplomacy rather than combat, carrying decorative weapons and surrounded on three sides by stone walls. The Spanish were in steel armour, mounted, armed with cutting weapons of edged metal, and operating from prepared positions with the element of complete surprise. The mismatch was total. The Spanish chroniclers do not record any organised resistance from the Inca side. They record instead a sustained panic in which thousands of people attempted simultaneously to escape from a plaza that had only one significant exit. People in the rear of the crowd, pressed forward against the front, prevented anyone at the front from reaching the open gate. People at the sides crushed against the walls trying to escape the cavalry. A section of the wall of one of the buildings reportedly collapsed under the pressure of human bodies pressed against it, opening an unintended escape route through which an unknown number of people fled into the streets beyond. The duration of the action is variously estimated. Most accounts settle on roughly half an hour from the signal shot to the end of significant fighting in the plaza. Some accounts place it shorter, at 20 minutes. The chronicler Cristobal de Mena, who was present, gave a figure of about half an hour. By the end of that period, several thousand people in the plaza were dead or dying. The imperial procession had been completely scattered, and Atahualpa himself had been seized. The capture of the emperor was the entire point of the operation, and it almost did not happen. The bearers of the imperial litter had not abandoned their charge during the chaos. They had stayed at their posts, holding the litter on their shoulders, even as the Spanish cavalry reached them. When one bearer fell, another took his place. When that one fell, another took his place again. The Spanish chroniclers, who otherwise tend toward triumphalism, write about the imperial bearers with what reads, even 5 centuries later, as genuine and somewhat shocked admiration. They describe men of obvious nobility and obvious devotion to their duty, who continued to hold up the litter of their sovereign even when it became clear that to do so was a sentence of death. The Spanish had to cut down successive ranks of bearers before the litter finally tilted to one side and the emperor was pitched from his seat. Pizarro himself reached him at that moment. He had moved forward with his personal guard during the chaos and was now beside the fallen litter. He reached down, took hold of the emperor's clothing, and pulled him out of the press of bodies. Atahualpa was not injured in any serious way. Pizarro had, by all accounts, given specific instructions before the action began that no one was to harm the emperor under any circumstances, on the perfectly clear logic that a dead Atahualpa was worth nothing to the operation, while a living one was worth everything. He sustained, in the chaos, only a minor cut to his own hand, inflicted accidentally by one of his own men in the confusion. That cut, sustained while protecting the emperor from harm, was the only Spanish injury recorded that day. The casualty count for the action is one of the most striking numbers in the historical record. By the most commonly accepted estimates, somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 people in the imperial procession lost their lives in the plaza or in the immediate aftermath, the wide range reflecting the inherent difficulty of counting bodies after a chaotic event in low light. Most modern historians settle on a figure of around 3,000, though even the most conservative estimate is grim by any honest reading. Spanish losses on the other side were essentially non-existent. Pizarro's cut hand was the only Spanish injury. Some accounts mention that one of the men attached to the column, of African origin, and serving in an enslaved or recently freed status under one of the Spanish officers, was killed during the action, although the details are unclear and other accounts do not mention any Spanish side death at all. Either way, the disparity in casualties between the two sides was, even by the harsh standards of 16th century colonial warfare, almost beyond belief. The Spanish had broken an imperial reception of several thousand people, while losing at most one of their own to friendly fire. To understand how this happened, you have to combine the factors discussed earlier and then add one more. The technological gap mattered. Steel armor against cotton tunics, lances and edged swords against decorative ceremonial weapons, cannon and harquebus against the complete absence of black powder in the Andean experience, horses used as shock cavalry against troops who had no concept of mounted combat. Each of these factors, on its own, would have produced a significant advantage in any open battle. Stacked together in a confined enclosed plaza against an opponent who was not even prepared for combat, they produced something close to total dominance. The psychological gap mattered. The Andean side had no template for what was happening. They were attending a diplomatic reception. The events unfolding in front of them did not match any category their world had ever produced. The combined sensory shock of cannon fire, charging horses, metal rattles, and armoured men cutting through the crowd produced a mass panic in which any organised resistance became impossible. People do not fight well when they do not know what they are fighting. By the time the surviving attendants in the plaza began to grasp the basic nature of the event, it was already over. The cultural gap mattered. The emperor had arrived for ceremony. He had not arrived for war. He had left the bulk of his actual army at the Bath complex. He had brought no organised military formation with him. He had brought instead the equivalent of a state occasion court, dressed for a diplomatic reception. By the rules he understood, this was the correct decision. By the rules the Spanish operated under, it was the situation that made the action possible, and the surprise mattered. None of the technological or psychological factors would have produced a comparable result if the Inca had been ready. An assembled imperial army, properly armed and arrayed in the open field, would have absorbed the Spanish cannon and harquebus fire, which recall was slow to reload and frequently misfired, drawn the cavalry into terrain where its advantages could be neutralized, and overwhelmed the small Spanish column with sheer weight of numbers. The Inca were perfectly capable of fighting effectively against superior technology, as they would prove repeatedly in the years that followed. What they could not do, on November 16th, was respond to a coordinated ambush they had been given no reason to anticipate. The whole event depended on the Andean side believing, until the moment it became impossible to keep believing, that they were attending a state reception. There was one more variable, and it is worth pausing on because it shaped everything that followed. The variable was the army at the Bath complex. The Imperial Army, 4 kilometres across the plain, watched the whole thing happen and did nothing. By the time the sounds of the action reached them in any clear form, the action was already over. The generals on the field had no orders to engage. The emperor, who would have given those orders, was already a prisoner. Without a clear chain of command, the army stood in place, in formation, waiting for instructions that did not come. By the time someone among the senior officers tried to organize a response, several hours had passed, the Spanish had consolidated their position in the town, and the most powerful argument against any military action was already in foreign hands. To attack Cajamarca now would mean to attack a town in which the Sapa Inca was being held. Any action that endangered the sacred person of the emperor was a religious as well as a political crisis. Andean theology, as already established, treated the body of the living son of the sun as sacred to a degree that ordinary subjects could not even properly look at. The idea of risking that body by attacking the town that held it was, for the generals on the field, very nearly unthinkable. The army did nothing. Within days, individual units began drifting away from the Bath complex, returning to their home garrisons or sitting in confused waiting, with no command structure functioning above them. That action did not come. The reason it did not come was that the imperial system had been designed, for a century, around a single decision-making authority at its centre. When that authority was removed, the system did not have an emergency mode. It did not have a procedure for what to do if the emperor was unavailable. There was no concept of a regency that could be invoked at short notice. There was no protocol for delegating military command in an emergency to the senior general on the scene. The whole edifice depended on the living son of the sun being available and giving orders. With him unavailable, the edifice did the only thing it knew how to do, which was wait. By nightfall on November 16th, 1532, the political situation of an empire of 10 million people had changed completely. The living son of the sun was a Spanish prisoner. His army was leaderless. His court was scattered. His brother, still in chains somewhere on the imperial road, had not been heard from. The centre of the empire had been seized in an action that lasted less than half an hour. The news began to move along the same beautifully maintained road network we discussed earlier. Within hours, runners were carrying word northward toward Quito and southward toward Cusco, although what exactly they carried is somewhat difficult to reconstruct, because the messengers themselves did not fully understand what had happened. The word that reached the senior generals on the next morning was a confused mixture of accurate observation and rumour. The strangers had attacked. The strangers had taken the emperor alive. The emperor was unhurt, but a prisoner. The court had been scattered. Many had been lost. No, the Sapa Inca had not been wounded. No, the Sapa Inca had not been killed. Yes, the Spanish were a small force. No, no other foreign army had appeared. The three senior commanders of the imperial military, the generals Calcuchimac, Quizquiz, and Ruminawi, were each in different parts of the empire at the moment of the action, and each received the news in a different state of readiness. Chalcachimac was on the road south, escorting Huascar back from Cusco as a prisoner of the regime. Quizquiz was in or near Cusco itself, consolidating the northern faction's victory in the recently captured capital. Ruminawi was in Quito, holding the northern provinces. None of the three was in a position to march on Cajamarca within days, and none of them was authorized to act without an order from the emperor that could no longer be given. They consulted. They sent runners back. They received in due course the only orders they were ever going to receive on the matter, and those orders, written under Spanish supervision and dictated by a prisoner, told them in clear and authoritative language to stand down and to take no action against the foreigners holding their sovereign. This single piece of correspondence, a quipu, and an accompanying verbal message delivered by trusted court messengers, did more to neutralize the imperial army than any amount of Spanish steel could have done. The generals, receiving orders that bore the unmistakable imprint of the Sapa Inca's own household, and that explicitly forbade any military movement against the prisoners' captors, did what disciplined officers do. They obeyed. The army stood down. Whatever opportunity there had been to crush the Spanish in the days following the action evaporated, not because of any technological or tactical limit, but because the chain of command had been turned into an instrument of paralysis by the very fact of the emperor's capture. That evening, Pizarro did something that the Spanish chroniclers describe with what reads as a kind of theatrical pride, although the practical purpose was obvious. He hosted the emperor at dinner. Atahualpa was brought to a building inside Cajamarca, washed, given clean clothing of fine Spanish cut to replace garments that had been damaged during the capture, and seated at a table opposite Pizarro himself. They ate together. They drank together. The Spanish commander, through Felipillo, expressed sincere regret that the day had unfolded the way it had. He explained that he meant the emperor no personal disrespect. He explained that the actions of the Spanish had been necessary in light of the perceived rejection of the Christian faith, but that the relationship between them now was a personal one, and that he, Pizarro, would treat the emperor with all the courtesy due to his rank. Atahualpa, by all accounts, accepted this with extraordinary composure. He ate the meal. He responded with grave dignity. He asked questions about Spain, about the foreign king, about the strange weapons, about the horses, about the religion. He gave no sign of distress. He did not weep. He did not threaten. He did not plead. He behaved throughout the entire evening exactly as one would expect a god-king to behave under any circumstances. The Spanish, who had spent the day on the action that had brought him here, found themselves at dinner with a man whose self-possession was so complete that several of them later wrote, in private letters, that they had been more impressed by his behaviour at the table than by anything they had encountered in the action itself. The conversation eventually turned, as both sides understood it would, to the question of what came next. The emperor was a prisoner. He understood this. The Spanish wanted something from him. He understood that too. He had spent the evening observing his captors, listening to their language, watching the way they looked at the gold ornaments still hanging from his ears and at the silver and feathered objects scattered around the room from the day's events. He had noticed, with the kind of attention that a sovereign trained from boyhood in close observation of court visitors might be expected to develop, where their eyes lingered. Their eyes lingered, repeatedly and unmistakably, on metal, the yellow metal in particular. He filed this observation away. He continued to eat his dinner. He continued to answer Pizarro's questions politely. And in the back of his mind, with the calm, strategic clarity of a man who has been raised to manage the resources of an empire, he began to construct the offer he was about to make. It would be the largest single ransom payment ever recorded in the history of the world, and it would not save him. Before we turn to that ransom, however, it is worth pausing for a moment on the larger meaning of what had just occurred. Roughly 30 minutes of action in a small provincial plaza by fewer than 200 men had taken control of an imperial structure that ran from the equator to the deserts of Chile and that contained 10% of the entire population of the Americas. 5,000 years of Andean political development, 3 generations of imperial consolidation, 90 years of relentless expansion, an army of 40,000 veteran soldiers, a road network unrivaled outside Rome, a logistical system that fed an entire continent without coins, and a religious authority that placed the throne at the literal centre of the universe. All of it had been bypassed in less time than it takes a modern audience to watch a long sitcom episode. Not destroyed, not defeated in battle, bypassed. The Spanish had not beaten the Empire. They had reached past it and grabbed the only person whose decisions the Empire was equipped to obey. The Empire kept obeying. It just obeyed someone else now. Spanish discipline that first night was tight. Pizarro posted heavy guards around the building where the emperor was held. He doubled the watch on the approaches to Cajamarca. He ordered the horses kept saddled in shifts. He sent out small mounted patrols to monitor the imperial camp at the bath complex and to give early warning of any military movement. He took no chances because he knew, better than anyone, how exposed his column still was. The fact that the action had succeeded did not mean it would continue to succeed. The whole position depended on the continued belief among the Inca that any aggressive move would endanger their sovereign. If that belief slipped at any point, the next morning would be the last morning the Spanish in Cajamarca ever saw. The belief did not slip. The army did not move. By dawn on November the 17th, the Spanish controlled the town in a way that bordered on the surreal, with thousands of imperial troops camped in plain sight across the valley, ordered by their own court to take no action, while a few dozen Spanish soldiers walked the perimeter of a small provincial plaza with their hostage at the centre of it all. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the strangest mornings in human history. And the strangeness was just getting started. It started, like most strangenesses, with a question about gold. Within 2 or 3 weeks of his capture, the emperor decided to make the Spanish an offer. He decided to make them an offer. Through Felipillo, sometime in the 2nd or 3rd week of his captivity, the emperor proposed a transaction. He pointed at the room in which he was being held. It was a substantial chamber by Cajamarca standards. The walls were of cut stone, the ceiling was high. The dimensions, according to the most commonly cited Spanish account, were roughly 22 feet long by 17 feet wide, with a ceiling reaching to a man's reach with arm extended. Atahualpa walked the length of the room. He reached up to mark a line on the wall as high as he could reach. He told Pizarro, through the translator, that he would fill the room with gold up to that line. He would also, he added, fill an adjacent and somewhat smaller chamber with silver, twice over, to compensate for what was generally understood to be silver's lower value compared to gold. In exchange for this payment, the strangers would release him and depart. The Spanish, when they understood what they had just heard, were initially sceptical. The room was not small. The volume the emperor was offering to fill represented, by any reasonable estimate, more precious metal than any single ruler in Europe had ever held in concentrated form. The combined gold reserves of every European monarchy of the early 16th century would have struggled to match what Atahualpa was casually offering as a personal payment for his freedom. Pizarro asked, through Felipillo, whether the emperor was certain he could actually deliver this. The emperor confirmed that he could. He pointed out, with the dry confidence of a man who had been raised to manage a continental tribute system, that the yellow and white metals existed in his empire in quantities the strangers had not yet begun to suspect, and that he had only to give the order for collection to begin. Pizarro agreed to the deal. He also, with what one suspects was barely concealed delight, instructed his secretary to draw up a formal written contract documenting the agreement, which Atahualpa was made to authorize through a ceremonial gesture, since he could not, in the Spanish sense, sign anything. The document was, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, the first written contract in the history of the Inca world. It would also be one of the more thoroughly violated written contracts in the history of any world. The emperor sent runners. The runners moved out across the empire, carrying his instructions to the regional governors, to the temple authorities, to the panakas of the dead emperors, to the keepers of the great storehouses, to the goldsmiths' workshops in every major town. The instructions were unambiguous. Every piece of worked gold and silver in the empire that could be spared from immediate ceremonial necessity was to be sent, at the emperor's order, to Cajamarca. The collection effort was to be conducted at speed. The destination was the Spanish-held town. The deadline was as fast as logistically possible. What followed was, by some considerable margin, the largest single transfer of precious metals in pre-industrial history. Caravans of llamas, porters, and human bearers began arriving in Cajamarca within weeks, carrying loads of gold and silver in every form the Andean world produced. Sheets of gold pried from the walls of palaces, ornaments stripped from temples, personal jewellery surrendered by nobles, ceremonial dishes from royal households, sacred objects from Huaca shrines. The great gold disc that hung in the central sun temple in Cusco, an enormous sheet of beaten gold representing Inti himself, was reportedly taken down and shipped north as part of the payment. The accumulated gold of the empire, much of it the product of 3 or 4 centuries of skilled metalwork, began piling up in the chamber that the emperor had measured for the purpose. The Spanish, with what was either practical efficiency or aesthetic tragedy depending on your point of view, immediately set about reducing the incoming material to bullion. They had no interest in the artistic value of what was arriving. They had interest only in the metallic weight. A team of native goldsmiths and silversmiths working under Spanish supervision was set up in Cajamarca with furnaces, crucibles, and forms for ingots. The exquisitely worked Andean masterpieces, some of them representing months of labour by master craftsmen using techniques that have never been fully reconstructed, were fed into the furnaces one by one. They emerged as bars. Each bar was stamped, weighed, and recorded. The total weight grew daily. The melting was an act of cultural destruction so complete that modern art historians still mourn it. We have today almost no surviving Inca metalwork of major scale. We have a few small ornaments, a handful of figurines, some objects that escaped the furnaces because they had been buried in tombs or hidden in mountain caves before the collection began. The vast majority of what the empire had produced, which by Spanish account included full-sized gold representations of plants, animals, human figures, and entire fields of corn rendered in worked gold, was reduced to anonymous bars over the course of several months in 1532 and 1533. It was, in artistic terms, one of the worst single losses to the cultural heritage of humanity. In financial terms, it was the largest single windfall any expedition had ever delivered to a European court. The actual quantities involved are themselves staggering and worth describing precisely. The room of gold, when complete, contained somewhere around 6,000 kilograms of gold by the Spanish accounting, with some estimates running higher. The 2 rooms of silver contained, in combined weight, around 12,000 kilograms. Modern attempts to convert these figures into contemporary equivalents always run into the problem that precious metals were worth dramatically more in the 16th century than they are today, both because they were less abundant and because they were the foundation of the European monetary system. The most generous modern estimate values the total Cajamarca ransom at somewhere between $400 million and $1 billion in current purchasing power, although the cultural value of the destroyed objects, if you could somehow put a number on it, would dwarf the metal price even now. In any case, it was, in the simple sense of the word, an unprecedented sum. No one had ever paid that much for anything. No one would for centuries afterward. The collection took roughly 8 months, from November of 1532, when the emperor made the offer, to about the middle of 1533, the caravans kept arriving. By the early summer of 1533, the rooms were essentially full. Atahualpa, working from inside captivity through a steady stream of runners, had delivered. He had also, throughout this period, continued to act as the functional ruler of his empire. The Spanish, who needed his cooperation to keep the gold flowing in, had not interfered with his court routines. He held audiences. He received reports from regional governors. He issued orders. The empire, despite the unusual fact that its central administration was now conducted from a single room in Cajamarca under foreign supervision, was still, in a strict mechanical sense, functioning. The chasqui system carried his orders. The granaries opened and closed on his command. The army at the Bath complex had withdrawn to its regional bases, but the regional commanders were still receiving instructions from their sovereign. The conquered provinces still paid their tribute. The empire was still, on paper, an empire. What the Spanish gradually realized, and what some of them seem to have realized rather faster than others, was that the longer Atahualpa stayed alive, the more dangerous he became. As long as he was in their custody, he was their hostage, and his empire took no aggressive action against them. But the empire was not idle, it was waiting. The longer the foreign occupation of Cajamarca dragged on, the more time the regional commanders had to assess the situation, to coordinate quietly with each other, and to consider what would happen if the foreigners ever ran out of usefulness for their captive king. There were rumours, real or invented depending on which account you trust, that imperial commanders in the north and east were assembling forces with the intent of marching on Cajamarca to free the emperor, and that the only thing holding them back was the explicit instruction from the emperor himself that no such action be undertaken. If that instruction were ever to lapse by the death of its author or by any other accident, the imperial machinery would have a fairly straightforward problem to address. In April of 1533, Spanish reinforcements arrived. A second column of about 150 men, under the command of an officer named Diego de Almagro, had been working its way inland from the coast and now joined the original force. The men of Almagro's column had not been present at the original action. They had not been hidden in the buildings around the plaza. They had not, in any meaningful sense, contributed to the operation that had produced the ransom. They nevertheless expected, when they arrived, to be cut into the spoils. The relationship between the original column and the newcomers was, from the very first day, tense. There were now nearly 350 Spanish in Cajamarca, all of whom believed themselves to be entitled to a share of the gold, and only a finite amount of gold available to share among them. The arithmetic of the situation was bad for Atahualpa. The presence of more soldiers in the town increased the operational confidence of the Spanish leadership and reduced their dependence on the emperor as a hostage shield. The new arrivals were less personally invested in the working relationship that had developed between Pizarro and the emperor over the previous months, and the larger force meant that any sudden Inca military movement against Cajamarca would now be even more difficult to organize, since the Spanish position was incrementally stronger than it had been in November. Sometime in the summer of 1533, the Spanish leadership began to discuss in increasingly explicit terms what to do with their prisoner. The arguments in favour of releasing him were obvious. The agreement had been honoured. He had delivered the ransom. To kill him after the payment had been made would be, by every standard of Spanish law and Catholic morality, a clear breach of contract and a sin in addition to a crime. Pizarro himself, by some accounts, was reluctant to move against the emperor. He had spent months in close contact with the man. He understood, perhaps better than any other European of his time, that Atahualpa was a remarkable person, a sovereign of extraordinary composure, an intellect that absorbed new information rapidly, and a useful instrument for governing the territories the Spanish had now somehow acquired. The arguments in favour of killing him were also obvious, at least to a certain kind of Spanish officer. He was, alive, a permanent risk. He was the legitimate emperor. His name commanded the loyalty of 40,000 soldiers across the empire. Any Spanish departure from Cajamarca that left him alive and free would result within weeks in his resumption of imperial authority, and almost certainly in a coordinated campaign to drive the foreigners out of the empire entirely. The Spanish, if they intended to remain, needed the emperor neutralized in a more permanent fashion. That was the unsentimental view, and it was the view that increasing numbers of officers in Cajamarca were willing to state out loud as the spring turned to summer. There was, finally, a more squalid factor at work. As long as the emperor was alive and protected by Pizarro, his property could not be seized. The Spanish had received the ransom for his life. They had not received, and could not legally claim, his ongoing wealth, his estates, his palaces, or the personal treasury that was still being held in trust for him by his court. The longer he lived, the longer all of that remained off the table. The shorter he lived, the sooner those additional resources became available for distribution. The mechanism eventually chosen to resolve the question was a trial. In July of 1533, a Spanish military court was convened in Cajamarca to consider the case against the emperor. The court was composed entirely of officers from the expedition, with Pizarro nominally presiding, with the Friar Valverde acting as the religious authority guiding the proceedings, and with a Spanish notary present to record the verdict. The charges were as follows. First, the emperor was accused of having ordered the death of his brother Huascar while in Spanish custody. The actual circumstances of Huascar's death are murky. He was being transported north when news of Atahualpa's capture reached his escort. According to the chronicles, the escort took it upon themselves to remove Huascar from the equation. either on standing orders from the emperor or more likely on their own initiative, fearing that the Spanish might prefer to install the captured rival on the throne. The death was real. The emperor's personal responsibility for it was, at best, indirect. It served the Spanish purposes to treat it as a direct order, since it implicated their prisoner in the killing of his own brother and provided a moral hook for the proceedings against him. Second, the emperor was charged with idolatry for his continued worship of Inti and the various other deities of the imperial pantheon. This charge had the convenient feature of being undeniable, since the emperor had indeed continued to practice the religion he had been born into and had never converted to Christianity. The fact that he had never been seriously asked to convert, and that the brief encounter with Valverde in the plaza could hardly be called a comprehensive missionary effort, was not addressed in the proceedings. Third, the emperor was charged with polygamy. He had multiple wives. This was true. By imperial Inca custom, a Sapa Inca had a primary wife, who was traditionally his sister, plus a substantial household of secondary wives drawn from the noble families of the empire. There was no concept in Andean culture that this was anything other than the normal arrangement for a sovereign. By Spanish Catholic standards, however, it constituted a grave moral offence. The fact that no one had ever objected to it before, and that the charge was being invented several months into the captivity of a man who had been chosen for capture precisely because of the imperial structure he embodied, did not appear in the formal record. Fourth, the emperor was charged with treason against the Spanish crown, on the grounds that he was suspected of communicating secretly with his commanders to plan a military attack on the Spanish position. Whether such communication had actually occurred is impossible to determine. There were reports, of varying reliability, that imperial forces had been observed assembling in the northern provinces. The Spanish chose to interpret these reports as evidence of a planned rescue operation that the emperor was secretly orchestrating from his quarters. He denied the charge when confronted with it. His denial was treated with the appropriate weight, which is to say none. The trial took, by the surviving accounts, only a few days. It produced a verdict of guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by burning at the stake. Valverde made one final intervention. He told the emperor, through Felipillo, that the sentence of burning could be commuted to a less painful form of execution if Atahualpa agreed to be baptized as a Christian before his death. The reasoning was both theological and practical. Theologically, a baptized Christian could not be burned alive, since fire was the punishment for unrepentant heretics. Practically, a baptized condemned man would have his body preserved and could be buried in consecrated ground, which would prevent the kind of mummification and ongoing veneration that the imperial system was set up to perform for its deceased rulers. The emperor considered the offer. He had spent 8 months in close observation of his captors. He had absorbed by this point a substantial amount of practical information about their beliefs, their categories, and their motivations. He understood what he was being offered. He understood what he was giving up. The mummification of his body, the establishment of his panica, the perpetual care of his memory by his descendants, all of these depended on his physical remains being intact and available for Andean ritual care. A Christian burial would, by the strict logic of Andean theology, terminate his afterlife as a presence in the world. He would not be carried in procession. He would not sit at imperial councils. He would not continue to advise his successors through specialized mediums. He would, in the Andean sense, end. He accepted the baptism anyway. He was given the Christian name Francisco after the Spanish commander as a final piece of acknowledgement of the relationship the two men had developed over the previous months. He was then taken to the central plaza of Cajamarca, the same plaza in which the original action had occurred 8 months earlier and was executed by a method called the garrote. The garrote was, by the standards of 16th century European justice, a relatively quick form of execution, involving a metal collar tightened from behind by a screw mechanism. The date was July 26th, 1533. The emperor was, at the time of his death, somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. The body was buried, according to Spanish accounts, with Christian rites in the church the foreigners had hastily built in Cajamarca during the months of captivity. It was, however, secretly recovered by Inca loyalists shortly afterward and taken back to one of the imperial palaces, where, according to certain Andean traditions, it received the proper mummification and was incorporated into the same panaca system the Spanish had hoped to deny it. The historical truth of this second burial is contested. The emotional truth is straightforward. The empire he had ruled was not willing to let him simply disappear. The execution was, by any honest assessment, an act of judicial murder dressed up in the legal forms of a trial that no one involved seriously believed. The charges were a mixture of the invented and the irrelevant. The verdict had been decided before the proceedings began. The conversion that secured the lesser form of execution was a piece of ceremonial theatre. The entire event was a calculated decision to remove a now inconvenient hostage in a manner that left the Spanish legal record technically clean. Several of the Spanish present, including a number of officers who would later write their memoirs, expressed at the time their personal reservations about the action. They did not, however, vote against the verdict. They went along and accepted their share of the additional treasure that the emperor's death released, and got on with the work of taking over an empire. The plainest moral observation is the simplest one. The Spanish had been paid. They had taken a deal. They had received in good faith the largest single payment in human history. And they had then, with the legal form still warm from the writing, killed the man who paid it. The word of a conquistador, it turned out, was worth exactly the gold he had not yet been given, and nothing afterward. For about a month after the execution, the Spanish in Cajamarca were in a position of considerable awkwardness. They had removed the emperor whose name commanded the loyalty of the imperial military. They had not yet replaced him with an alternative. They controlled, in any meaningful military sense, only the town of Cajamarca itself, and the immediate route back to the coast. The vast bulk of the empire continued to exist, with its administrative apparatus still operating in regional centres across 2,000 kilometres of mountain terrain, and the news of the emperor's death was, even as Pizarro considered his next move, propagating outward along the road network and creating in its wake a political vacuum that would have to be filled by someone. The Spanish solution, which they began to develop almost immediately, was to install a puppet. There were plenty of candidates. The imperial royal family was, despite the catastrophes of the previous decade, still a large group. Huayna Capac had fathered numerous children. Many of these were still alive. Many of them, in fact, had reasons to want the Spanish on their side, since they had personal grievances with Atahualpa or with his faction, and saw in the foreigners a possible vehicle for advancement. Pizarro selected a man named Tupac Hualpa. He was a younger half-brother of both Atahualpa and Huascar. He had spent most of his life on the southern side of the imperial dynasty. He had been associated before the civil war with Huascar's faction. He was therefore acceptable to the Cusco-based Panicas who had survived the recent purges and were now looking for any candidate who might restore some version of their position. He was also, importantly, young, inexperienced, politically isolated from the senior generals of the army, and entirely dependent on Spanish support for any claim to legitimacy. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of figurehead Pizarro needed. He was crowned in Cajamarca with the appropriate rituals. He took the Mascai Pacha. He was acknowledged by such of the imperial nobility as had survived to attend the ceremony as the new Sapa Inca. He then accompanied the Spanish column on its march southward toward Cusco. The Spanish, having installed their preferred emperor, intended to occupy the imperial capital and consolidate their position at the heart of the empire. Tupac Hualpa did not live to see Cusco. 2 weeks into the march, he became suddenly and severely ill. He died within days. The Spanish chroniclers attributed his death to natural causes, possibly an unspecified fever. Other accounts, both contemporary and modern, have suggested that he was poisoned, either by surviving members of Atahualpa's faction who saw him as a southern usurper, or by members of his own court who had decided that his cooperation with the foreigners was disqualifying. The truth has never been established. The practical effect was that Pizarro found himself, halfway to Cusco, without an emperor. He selected a new candidate. The replacement was a young man named Manco Inca, another half-brother, this one from a different segment of the dynasty. Manco was the son of Huayna Capac by a wife who was not the principal queen but who had held respectable rank. He was young, by the most accepted estimates around 19 years old at the time of his selection. He was intelligent, he was personable, he had the right family credentials, with claims to both the Atahualpa and the Huascar segments of the broken dynasty. And for several years, he played the assigned role with apparent willingness. When the Spanish column finally entered Cusco in November of 1533, Manco was at Pizarro's side. He was acknowledged by the city's surviving nobility as the legitimate Sapa Inca. He took up residence in one of the imperial palaces. He participated in ceremonies. He gave orders that were, in form if not always in content, his own. The arrangement for the first 2 years or so was a workable fiction. There was an emperor on the throne. There were Spaniards advising the emperor. The empire continued to operate in a battered and reduced form, with the administrative machinery still grinding along, the relay runners still carrying messages, the granaries still distributing food, the textile workshops still producing cloth. What broke the arrangement was, predictably, the behaviour of the Spanish colonists themselves. The original column of conquistadors that had captured Atahualpa was now spreading out across the empire, establishing themselves as the new aristocracy of a colonial regime that had not yet been formally created in Spain, but that they were creating on the ground anyway. They claimed estates. They claimed personal services from local populations. They claimed in many cases individual native women as concubines or unofficial wives. They lived, in short, the way Spanish freebooters at the edge of empire have lived in every period of history, which is to say without significant restraint. The Pizarro brothers themselves were among the worst offenders. The commander had several younger brothers and half-brothers, all of whom had come to Peru with him, and several of whom were now, in his frequent absence, he had taken to travelling between Cusco, the new colonial capital he was building on the coast at Lima, and other parts of the empire, running affairs in Cusco. Gonzalo Pizarro and Juan Pizarro in particular conducted themselves with an arrogance that even other Spanish officers later described in their memoirs as excessive. They took for themselves whatever caught their interest. They publicly insulted local nobility, and they did something that, more than any other single set of actions, made the existing arrangement impossible to maintain. They took several of Manco's own wives, including his principal queen, and treated them openly as their own. In a culture where the women of the royal household were sacred, and where their persons were a matter of imperial dignity, the offence was beyond imagining. It was not just personal, it was theological. It was the public desecration of the imperial line. Manco endured it for as long as he could. Then, in the spring of 1536, he stopped enduring it. He requested permission from Hernando Pizarro, who was then commanding in Cusco, to leave the city briefly to conduct a religious ceremony at a sacred site in the surrounding mountains. The ceremony was, he explained, of considerable theological importance and required his personal participation. He could not lead it from inside the city. He needed to go to the site itself. Hernando, who had relied on Manco's cooperation for years, agreed. The young emperor was provided an escort and allowed to depart. He did not return. What he did instead was conduct, in the mountains outside Cusco, exactly the religious ceremony he had described, and then, with the discreet support of the imperial network that had been quietly waiting for this moment for 3 years, summon his army. The summons travelled along the same road network, through the same relay runners, to the same regional centres that had served the empire under his predecessors. The instructions were unambiguous. The young Sapa Inca was raising the empire in arms. The strangers in Cusco were to be expelled. Every warrior who could be assembled was to march on the imperial capital. The response was, by some considerable margin, the largest indigenous military mobilization of the entire colonial period. By the summer of 1536, Manco had assembled a force estimated at somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 fighters, drawn from across the highland provinces. They surrounded Cusco, they cut the roads, they burned the surrounding fields, they set up camps on the heights overlooking the city, and they began, in late April or early May of 1536, a siege that would last for nearly a year. The Spanish in Cusco at the time of the siege numbered around 200 men, plus a few thousand native allies. They were vastly outnumbered. The city itself was difficult to defend, since it had been built as an imperial capital, with open plazas and ceremonial spaces rather than fortifications, and since the heights above it were now occupied by Manco's forces. The besieging army employed, among other tactics, the dropping of red-hot stones wrapped in cotton onto the thatched roofs of buildings within the city, producing a series of fires that gradually destroyed large parts of Cusco. Spanish accounts describe the besieged force fighting through smoke and falling embers, with the cathedral they had recently begun building partially burned, with most of the original royal palaces partially or entirely consumed, with the imperial granaries in flames. The Spanish survived barely through a combination of factors. The first was their cavalry. Manco's army, although vastly more numerous, was still operating with the conventional Andean equipment and tactics. The Spanish cavalry, in small but coordinated charges, was repeatedly able to break Inca formations in the open ground around the city. The cost in horses was enormous. By the end of the siege, the Spanish were down to a handful of mounts, but the cavalry sorties, while they lasted, prevented Manco's forces from ever pressing a decisive assault on the city itself. The second factor was the fortress of Sacsayhuaman. This was the massive Inca-built citadel on the heights above Cusco, the same fortress whose enormous polygonal stones had been laid centuries earlier to defend the capital. Manco's forces had occupied it at the start of the siege, and were using it as a base for the assault on the city below. Juan Pizarro, one of the brothers, led a desperate counterattack on the fortress. The attack succeeded in taking the citadel after several days of intense fighting, with Juan himself mortally wounded by a stone to the head during the final assault. The loss of Sacsayhuaman was, for Manco, a serious tactical blow. The high ground above the city was now back in Spanish hands, and the encirclement was no longer complete. The third and most important factor was the native auxiliaries. This is the part of the story that, in popular retellings, often gets buried under the more colourful descriptions of conquistadors and cavalry charges, but it deserves to be brought into the open. The Spanish in Cusco were not surviving on their own. They were surviving because tens of thousands of indigenous Andean people, drawn from communities that had been conquered by the Inca within the past century, and that had little reason to feel any loyalty to the imperial dynasty, were fighting on the Spanish side. The relevant communities included, among others, the Cañari from the northern Andes, the Chachapoya from the cloud forests of the east, the Huanca from the central highlands, and various smaller groups from the coastal regions. Each of these peoples had been brought into the empire by force within the past 2 or 3 generations. Each of them had suffered the relocation policies, the tribute demands, the imperial taxation, and the cultural pressure that the Inca system imposed on conquered populations. Each of them remembered, in the way that conquered peoples remember these things, who had done what to whom in the recent past. And each of them now saw, in the foreign newcomers, an opportunity to settle old accounts with the empire that had so recently subjugated them. The Spanish provided steel, horses, leadership, and political cover. The native allies provided manpower, local knowledge, supply lines, and, crucially, the will to fight a long war against the imperial centre. Without those allies, the Spanish in Cusco would almost certainly have been overwhelmed during the siege. With them, the besieged force was able to hold out sortie effectively and gradually wear down Manco's army through attrition and through the steady erosion of its supply situation. This is one of the points that the simple version of the conquest story tends to obscure. The defeat of the Inca was not Europeans against Andeans. It was a particular faction of Andeans, allied to the Europeans, against the imperial dynasty that had recently conquered them, with the Spanish supplying the technology and the unfamiliar tactics and the indigenous coalition supplying nearly everything else. Manco's army, like all pre-modern armies, was a seasonal force. Its members were farmers, primarily conscripted from their home villages for the campaigning season. By the late autumn of 1536, with the planting season approaching, large numbers of the besieging force began drifting away, returning to their fields. The Sapa Inca could not maintain the siege at full strength through the winter and into the next agricultural year. He attempted to hold what he could. He failed. By early 1537, the siege had effectively broken up. Manco withdrew with his remaining loyal forces into the mountains east of Cusco, into a region of broken terrain and dense cloud forest that the Spanish would never be able to fully penetrate. He took with him his remaining wives, his court, his keepers of the knots, his priests, and a substantial body of warriors. He set up in the remote uplands of a region called Vilcabamba what would become the last functioning Inca state in history. What he left behind in Cusco was a Spanish position that had held on just barely, and a colonial regime that was now beginning to take root with a permanence that the early conquistadors had not, in their initial improvisations, imagined would be possible. The empire was, by any reasonable measure, finished. What survived in Vilcabamba was something different, something smaller, something quietly defiant, and it would take another 36 years to finally end. The 36 years in question began in the cloud forests east of Cusco, where the dry highland landscape of the central Andes gives way, almost dramatically, to something else entirely. The eastern slope of the mountains catches the moisture coming up from the Amazon basin, and the result is a region of vertical green walls draped in mist, of waterfalls dropping from invisible cliffs, of rivers that disappear into ravines so steep the human eye cannot follow them all the way down. The land is steep, hostile to wheeled traffic of any kind, and from a strategic perspective almost ideally designed to make pursuit difficult. There are few open valleys. The terrain breaks every advance into single-file lines along narrow trails. Visibility is short because the clouds are thick. The temperature is gentle, but the air is full of insects. The soil is too steep for major agriculture, and the political authority of any outside power tends, as a matter of practical geography, to dissolve about a day's march in from the edge. This was the region Manco chose for his retreat. The specific area was called Vilcabamba, a name that has since been applied to a number of nearby sites in slightly conflicting ways, but which in its essential meaning referred to a remote upland district drained by the Urubamba and Apurimac rivers, accessible only through a small number of narrow approaches that the imperial engineers, fortunately for the new fugitive court, had thought to build small forts and bridges along during the empire's expansionary period. He occupied these works, he repaired them, he built new ones. He selected a site in a valley deep inside the region, surrounded by ridges, and there he founded what would become the capital of the last Inca state. It was called by his court simply Vilcabamba, although later Spanish documents sometimes use longer names to distinguish it from other settlements in the area. The state he built there was, in scale, a tiny remnant of the empire he had lost. It was, in spirit, very nearly a complete one. He brought with him, when he withdrew from the failed siege of Cusco, a substantial body of warriors, his immediate court, his keepers of the knots, his priests, his physicians, his weavers, his masons, his cooks, his musicians, and a number of his wives, including the principal queen he had managed to recover after her time with the Pizarro brothers. He brought as well the sacred objects of the imperial cult that had survived the catastrophes of the previous decade. There were rumours, persistent throughout the colonial period and never quite confirmed, that he had also brought several of the royal mummies of his ancestors, removed in secret from their Cusco palaces and carried into the mountains in sealed bundles so the Spanish would not find them and either destroy them or pillage their treasure. The truth of this remains debated by archaeologists today. What is certain is that he established, in his new mountain capital, a working imperial court complete with the rituals, the ceremonies, and the protocols that had defined Andean kingship for a century. He also kept fighting. Manco was not a man who had withdrawn into the mountains to retire. He was a man who had withdrawn to a defensible position from which to continue the war by other means. For the next 7 years, from 1537 to his death in 1544, he conducted what would today be called an insurgency. His forces, operating from bases inside Vilcabamba, raided Spanish settlements across the central Andes. They attacked supply convoys on the main roads. They harassed colonists who had set themselves up on confiscated estates in the highlands. They sheltered runaway servants, escaped tribute workers, and dissidents from the colonial system. They struck quickly and withdrew into terrain where Spanish cavalry could not follow. They were, by the standards of conventional warfare, a constant nuisance. By the standards of political symbolism, they were a permanent open wound in the legitimacy of the colonial regime. Every raid reminded the Spanish that the Sapa Inca was still on his throne. Every withdrawal back into the cloud forests reminded the surrounding indigenous population that the imperial dynasty had not, in fact, ended. Manco himself died in 1544, in one of those small and quietly absurd episodes that occasionally interrupt otherwise grand historical narratives. A group of Spanish renegades had taken refuge in Vilcabamba some years earlier. They were followers of Diego de Almagro, the same officer who had brought reinforcements to Cajamarca during the ransom collection, and who had subsequently quarrelled bitterly with the Pizarro brothers over the division of the conquered empire. The Almagrist faction had lost the resulting civil war among the Spanish, with Almagro himself executed by the Pizarros in 1538. Several of his surviving lieutenants had fled into Vilcabamba seeking refuge from the victors, on the theory that the enemy of my enemy was a more reliable host than the cousins who had recently won the war back in Cusco. Manco had given them shelter. He had treated them, by the standards of his hospitality, well. They lived in the imperial capital. They participated in court life. They taught Manco's officers, by some accounts, how to ride horses and use Spanish weapons, with the goal of incorporating these innovations into the Vilcabamba military. In April of 1544, for reasons that have never been entirely clear, The standard explanations involve some combination of homesickness, a desire to make peace with the new colonial government, and the calculation that delivering a captured Inca emperor would buy them a pardon. The renegades turned on their host. They attacked the Sapa Inca while he was playing a game of skill in one of the courtyards of the palace. He was unarmed. He was caught entirely by surprise. He died of his injuries within days. His attackers, on attempting to flee Vilcabamba, were caught by his guards and dealt with in turn. Having achieved exactly nothing in their betrayal, except the elimination of the most charismatic of the late-period Inca rulers and the addition of their own names to the long list of people who have managed to combine treachery with stupidity in a single afternoon. Manco's death did not end the Vilcabamba state. He had several sons, and the imperial system had long experience with succession problems. The eldest of his sons, a boy named Sayri Tupac, was acknowledged as the new Sapa Inca, although since he was still a child at the time of his father's death, the actual government was conducted by senior advisors and noble relatives acting as regents. The state continued, the raids continued, the court continued to perform the rituals and ceremonies that defined an Inca capital. For the next 30 years, the Vilcabamba state existed in a kind of strange equilibrium with the colonial Peru that surrounded it. The Spanish never managed to mount a successful military expedition into the region. The terrain defeated several attempts. The Inca, on their side, did not have the strength to retake any significant area of the highlands. They could raid, they could pressure, they could not break out. The Spanish, on their side, could attempt invasions, but they could not sustain them. The two sides therefore settled over the years into a series of diplomatic exchanges punctuated by periodic violence. Spanish envoys were sometimes received in Vilcabamba. Inca envoys sometimes travelled to Cusco. Treaties were occasionally proposed. Pardons were sometimes offered. None of these arrangements ever fully resolved the basic incompatibility between a colonial regime that needed total authority and an indigenous state that refused to acknowledge that authority. Sayri Tupac, as he grew older, eventually negotiated his own departure from the mountains. In 1558, after long correspondence with the colonial viceroy, he accepted an offer of titles, lands, and a pension in exchange for leaving Vilcabamba and accepting baptism in the colonial system. He moved to a Spanish-controlled estate near Cusco. He took the Christian name Diego. He lived in something approaching comfort for the next 3 years, until his death in 1561, under circumstances that the more suspicious commentators of the time, and a great many modern historians have suspected were not entirely natural. Whatever the cause, his death broke whatever fragile arrangement had been reached, and the leadership in Vilcabamba reverted to one of his brothers. That brother was Titu Cusi Yupanqui. He was older than Sayri Tupac, but had not been the original choice for succession because of an irregularity in his lineage. With Sayri Tupac gone, however, he was the senior surviving son of Manco and the natural leader of what was left of the dynasty. He took up the Masquipacha. He governed Vilcabamba from his father's old capital. He was, by all accounts, a thoughtful and politically able man, and he spent the next decade managing a careful diplomatic dance with the colonial regime, while also keeping the resistance alive. He commissioned, in 1570, a remarkable document called the Instrucción, which he dictated to a Spanish friar, and which was intended to be his official account sent to the Spanish king of the Inca side of the recent history of Peru. It is one of the few primary sources we have for the Inca version of the conquest. It is also one of the more sophisticated political documents of the entire colonial period, presenting the Spanish takeover from the perspective of the people on the receiving end and arguing, with considerable patience, that the dynasty deserved to be treated as a legitimate sovereign power rather than as rebels in their own land. Titu Cusi died in 1571, again under circumstances that some historians find suspicious and others attribute to natural illness. The chronicles report him falling ill suddenly, becoming feverish, and dying within a few days, despite the attentions of both indigenous and Spanish-trained physicians. His death brought to the throne the last of Manco's sons. His name was Tupac Amaru, and his story, brief as it was, is the proper ending of the imperial dynasty. Tupac Amaru was younger than his brothers. He had not been heavily involved in the diplomatic negotiations of the previous decade. He had grown up entirely within Vilcabamba, with no significant exposure to the Spanish world that surrounded it. He spoke no Spanish. He had received the traditional Inca education in ceremonial knowledge, statecraft, and military training, and he was, by the standards of his court, a properly raised heir to the dynasty. He was, however, taking the throne at a moment when the diplomatic patience of the colonial regime was about to run out. The man who would end that patience was a new viceroy named Francisco de Toledo. Toledo arrived in Peru in 1569 with a clear mandate from the Spanish king to reorganize the colony and to bring all outstanding political problems to a final resolution. He was a competent administrator, a man of considerable energy, and a person who did not enjoy unresolved diplomatic situations. The continuing existence of an independent Inca state in the mountains east of Cusco struck him as an embarrassment that should have been ended decades earlier, and one that he intended to end now. The pretext came in 1572. A Spanish ambassador sent into Vilcabamba had been killed on the road, in circumstances that may or may not have involved official Inca responsibility. Toledo treated the killing as a deliberate act of war by the Inca state. He declared the previous agreements with the dynasty void. He mobilized a substantial military expedition, this time with proper logistical preparation, native guides who knew the cloud forest terrain, and the kind of patient siege warfare that the Spanish had not previously been willing to commit to. The force entered Vilcabamba in the spring of 1572. The Inca resistance was determined, but, in the end, not enough. The terrain that had defended the state for 35 years was, this time, navigated successfully by the invading column. The forts were taken one by one, the bridges were captured, the towns of the small imperial state were evacuated. Tupac Amaru, with a small group of loyalists, fled deeper into the forest, attempting to reach the lowland Amazon basin where the Spanish would not follow. He took with him his pregnant wife. He took with him several of his most senior advisers. He took with him the imperial Masque Pacha and a small number of sacred objects. He moved fast. The Spanish moved faster. A small group of pursuers, travelling light, caught up with him in a region of the lower jungle some distance from the original capital. He was apprehended. His wife, his advisers, and his royal symbols were taken with him. He was brought back to Cusco in chains, paraded through the streets of the imperial capital that his ancestors had built, and presented in the central plaza in the autumn of 1572. He was tried for rebellion against the Spanish crown. The charges, like the charges against the original emperor 4 decades earlier, were a mixture of the technical and the symbolic. He was the leader of a state that had refused to acknowledge Spanish authority. He had inherited that position from his brothers, who had inherited it from his father, who had taken it up when he abandoned the puppet throne the conquerors had installed for him. By the legal logic of the colonial regime, every member of the Vilcabamba dynasty since Manco's escape had been in continuous rebellion against the rightful sovereign of Peru, who was, by Spanish law, the King of Spain. The fact that the Inca dynasty had been the rightful sovereign of Peru for a century before any Spaniard had ever set foot in the country was not addressed in the proceedings. The verdict was death. Tupac Amaru was held in Cusco for a brief period before his execution. During this time, he was visited by Catholic priests who explained the situation to him and offered, as had been offered to his predecessor in Cajamarca, the option of conversion. He accepted. He was baptized. The chroniclers report him receiving the rite with great composure, listening to the explanations of the friars, and asking thoughtful questions about the religion he was being incorporated into. His questions, by some accounts, were searching enough that the friars later admitted to one another, in private letters, that they had not expected a jungle-raised emperor to be quite so philosophically capable. On the day of his execution, which was September 24th, 1572, he was led to the central plaza of Cusco. The plaza was, by every account, packed with the indigenous population of the city, who had come to witness the ending of their dynasty in person. The chroniclers describe enormous crowds, weeping openly, calling out to the emperor as he was brought into the square. The young Sapa Inca, by their accounts, was utterly composed. He stood on the wooden platform that had been built for the occasion. He turned to face the crowd. He raised one hand to ask for silence. He spoke briefly, in Quechua, to his people. The exact words have come down to us in several versions, all of which broadly agree. He told them that the line of the Inca, the family of the sun, was now ending in him. He told them that he had taken the religion of the foreigners as a matter of acceptance, but that they should remember the gods of their ancestors and the dignity of their own line. He told them not to mourn beyond what was proper. He told them to live well. He turned, after this, to face the executioner. The sentence was carried out. the dynasty that had ruled the four parts joined together, that had built the roads and the storehouses and the terraces and the bridges, that had carried the line of Inti across thousands of kilometres of mountain country for a century, ended on a wooden platform in a colonial plaza, in front of a weeping crowd of its own subjects, in the late afternoon of an early autumn day in the year 1572. That, in the strict political sense, was the end of the Inca Empire. The line of the Sapa Inca was extinguished. The independent state had been absorbed. The maskipacha would never be worn again by a recognised emperor of the four parts. The dynastic story, as a dynastic story, was over. The civilization, however, did not end. This is the point of the entire story that, if you take only the political narrative away, you will have missed entirely. The defeat of an empire is not the same thing as the disappearance of a people. The Inca state collapsed. The cultural world it had built kept going. The most obvious place this is visible is the language. The imperial administrative language Quechua had been spread across the empire during the years of expansion as a working tongue for trade, taxation, and government. After the empire ended, the language did not. It continued to be spoken in the homes, the markets, and the fields of the Andean countryside. The Spanish, who had inherited an administrative system that already used Quechua as its everyday medium, continued to use it themselves for practical purposes, even producing Quechua language religious texts to spread Catholicism more efficiently among the indigenous population. 5 centuries later, Quechua is still spoken by something like 8 to 10 million people across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina, and Chile, making it by some margin the most widely spoken indigenous language in the Americas. Closely related Aymara, the language of the southern Lake Titicaca region, has another 2 to 3 million speakers. The languages that had been carried by the empire have outlived the empire by 500 years, and counting. The buildings did the same thing. The Spanish who arrived in Cusco in the 1530s did not on the whole tear down Inca architecture. They built on top of it. They saved themselves the labour of clearing perfectly good stone walls by using them as foundations for the colonial structures they erected over them. The Cathedral of Cusco was built on the foundations of the old palace of the 8th Inca Emperor. The Dominican convent of Santo Domingo was built directly on top of the Great Sun Temple, the Coricancha, with substantial sections of the original Inca walls still standing inside the colonial structure today. The famous 12-sided stone, mentioned earlier in this story, sits in a wall along a busy street in modern Cusco, still perfectly fitted to its neighbours, still load-bearing, still doing the job it was built to do 500 years ago, with a modern colonial structure resting on top of it. Walk through Cusco today and you can see, again and again, the lower courses of pre-conquest stonework holding up the upper courses of colonial brick. The two architectures are physically locked together. Neither has crushed the other. They have instead become a single hybrid construction that holds its shape only because both layers continue to do their work. The same hybridization happened to the religion. The Catholic Church spent the colonial centuries trying to suppress the older Andean beliefs, with mixed success. Local communities continued, often quietly, to honour the Apus, the mountain spirits, by leaving offerings at high passes, by greeting them in the morning, by including them in agricultural ceremonies that the Church had not managed to fully replace. Pachamama, the Earth Mother, never went away. Her ceremonies were folded gently and persistently into the Catholic calendar, until by the end of the colonial period it was sometimes hard to say where one religious system ended and the other began. A village patron saint in modern highland Peru may have an official Catholic feast day on the church calendar and an unofficial parallel identity as the spirit of a particular mountain or river, with offerings made to one face of the figure inside the church and offerings made to the other face on the slopes outside it. This is not a contradiction in the local view. It is a layered understanding, much like the architecture, in which two systems are doing their work simultaneously, neither erasing the other. The festival survived. Inti Raymi, the great solstice festival of the sun, banned by the colonial authorities in the late 16th century, was quietly preserved by indigenous communities through more than 3 centuries of suppression, and was openly revived in the 20th century. It is now celebrated annually in Cusco, drawing tens of thousands of visitors and being performed by descendants of the population that originally created it. Carnival in the Andean countries combines Catholic Lenten ceremony with much older pre-conquest agricultural festivals in a fusion that no liturgical purist would approve of, but that nobody, in practice, ever seriously tried to disentangle. The braided grass bridge mentioned earlier, the Keswachaka, is still rebuilt every year by the descendants of the original communities, using the same techniques, with the same materials, in a ceremony that has been continuously practiced for half a millennium. The textiles survive too, in a way that deserves its own moment of attention. The weaving traditions that had clothed an empire, taught in childhood to girls of the Elu, and refined over generations into an intricate language of colour, pattern and structure, were never lost. Modern Andean weaving is among the most technically sophisticated in the world, and the patterns in many highland villages today can be read by their wearers as carrying meaning, encoding family identity, regional origin, marital status, ritual role, and a great deal else. A traditional Quechua poncho is, in a quiet sense, a kind of fabric quipu. The information it carries is not arithmetic, it is identity. Master weavers in places like Chinchero and Pisac still produce textiles of a quality that would have impressed the supervisors of the imperial workshops, working on backstrap looms whose basic design has not meaningfully changed in over 1,000 years. The empire also turned out to have left things hidden that the Spanish never found. The conquerors had taken Cusco and Vilcabamba. They had pillaged the obvious capitals, the obvious temples, the obvious palaces. They had not, however, mapped the empire completely. Many sites in the more remote sections of the Inca world were never visited by colonial authorities at all, and a number of them sat quietly in the cloud forests and on remote ridges, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation for centuries. The most famous of these is the site we now call Machu Picchu. The Spanish never went there. The colonial administration apparently never knew it existed. Local communities in the surrounding region were aware of it, in a quiet way that did not always reach colonial ears, but the wider world remained ignorant. The site was finally brought to international attention in 1911 by an American academic named Hiram Bingham, who was guided to it by local farmers who had been using the lower terraces for crops and who, when asked about the old stone city above, were perfectly willing to take a curious foreigner up the trail to see it. The sight that emerged from beneath the vegetation was, by any account, one of the most extraordinary preserved examples of late imperial Inca architecture anywhere in the world. The polished walls were intact. The terraces were intact. The water channels still ran. The astronomical alignment still worked. A whole small piece of the empire had been kept, by sheer luck and remoteness, in something close to its original condition. It has since become the most recognized symbol of the civilization that built it, photographed from the same angle on so many calendars, postcards and screensavers that it has become almost generic in modern visual culture. Behind the image, however, there is the actual fact of it. A place built by people who did not have writing, did not have the wheel, did not have iron, and did not have horses. A place that still stands intact, 1,000 years after they finished it, on a knife-edge ridge above a river none of them ever named the way we do now. The food survived as well. The potato, the tomato, the chili, quinoa, amaranth, oca, uluco, mashua, kiwicha. These are all crops that were domesticated in the Andes by the peoples whose engineering created the empire and whose descendants kept growing them in the same fields, often on the same terraces, after the empire ended. The potato alone, taken back to Europe by the Spanish, would reshape global agriculture so completely that the modern populations of Ireland, Russia, China, India, and a dozen other countries cannot really be understood without it. The terraces themselves, the climate machines we discussed at the beginning of this story, are still in active agricultural use across the highlands. Modern farmers plant on them, modern crops grow on them, the engineering still works, and the people themselves are still there. The descendants of the population that built the empire, that delivered the ransom, that buried the mummies in caves and that walked back into Cusco to watch the last emperor die, still live in the same villages, in the same valleys, on the same terraces, speaking the same language. They are today the majority population of Peru and Bolivia, large minorities in Ecuador, and a significant indigenous community in northern Chile and Argentina. They have, in the past 5 centuries, lived through colonization, revolutions, civil wars, dictatorships, displacement, and dramatic economic upheavals. They have also kept their songs, their textiles, their festivals, their food, and their fundamental sense of who they are and where they come from. The empire that organized them is gone. The civilization that produced the empire is, on any honest reckoning, still here. The name Tupac Amaru itself never really faded. It became, over the centuries, a symbol of resistance. The most famous case is the Great Uprising of 1780 and 1781, led by a man who took the name Tupac Amaru as a deliberate echo of the last emperor and who claimed to be a direct descendant of the imperial line. That rebellion, suppressed by the colonial authorities at enormous cost, nearly succeeded in driving Spain out of the southern Andes and would have permanent consequences for the regional politics of the next century. The name went on to be picked up in the 20th century by various political movements, by writers and poets and musicians, in a continuous chain of remembrance that has never quite let the original story go. A young Sapa Inca, who spoke a few words in Quechua on a wooden platform 500 years ago, is, in this strange way, still being quoted and invoked, generation after generation, by descendants who have never let his memory be filed away as merely historical. The story we have been following is, finally, not really a story about a defeat. It is a story about a particular kind of survival. The political structure that called itself Tawantinsuyu, the four parts joined together, did not survive. It was undone, in slow stages, by events that no one in the early 16th century could have predicted and that no Andean institution had been designed to absorb. The dynasty ended, the empire ended, the state ended. But the people who had been the empire kept walking the same paths, kept speaking the same words, kept growing the same crops on the same terraces, kept watching the same sun come up over the same mountains, and kept, in the quiet, stubborn way that civilizations do, being themselves. 500 years later, you can still walk into a market in Cusco and hear the conversations being conducted in Quechua. You can still stand in front of a wall that was built by a master mason in the reign of Pachacuti and feel the precise weight of the stones holding each other in place. You can still climb to a high pass and find a small offering left by someone who, that morning, greeted the mountain in the language of their grandmother. The empire, in other words, was strange. It was strange in the sense that its political structure was uniquely vulnerable to a precise sequence of shocks that no one had ever delivered before. But it was also strong, in ways its conquerors did not understand at the time, and that the modern world is still in the process of recognizing. It built roads that are still walked on. It carved stones that are still standing. It raised crops that feed billions of people today. It spread a language that is the everyday voice of millions. It taught its descendants how to take the very land it had built itself out of and to keep loving it across centuries of trouble. That is the strange thing that was wrong with the Inca Empire. Not really wrong at all, in the deeper sense. Just optimized for one specific set of conditions, then unlucky in a way that history occasionally hands out, and then transformed into something that is still going on, in the homes and the festivals and the songs and the fields of the descendants of the people who built it. We have come a long way together tonight, from a small ridge above the valley of Cajamarca to a quiet evening 500 years later. The story has been one of the strangest in human history, and we have not, in any honest sense, exhausted it. The Andean world is still there. The conversation continues. Mountains are still being greeted in the morning, in a language that an emperor once spoke from a litter carried on the shoulders of 80 men. For tonight, however, we have walked enough mountain road together. May your evening be calm, your thoughts gentle, and your rest deep. Sleep well, dear listeners. Sweet dreams.